The scattering of the Primarchs remains one of the most catastrophic events in Imperial history, a moment when the Chaos Gods reached through the veil of reality and tore the Emperor's gene sons from their gestation pods on Terra. Each infant Primarch was cast across the galaxy, landing on distant worlds that would shape their character and destiny. For the being who would become known as Vulkan, fate delivered him to Nocturne, a death world in the Segmentum Ultima, whose volcanic fury and radiation-scorched landscape would forge him into something unique among his brothers. Nocturne was not a world that welcomed life. The planet's proximity to its moon, Prometheus, created a gravitational dance that resulted in catastrophic tectonic activity. Every 15 Terran years, when the two celestial bodies drew closest in an event the natives called the Time of Trial, the planet's surface became a hell of erupting volcanoes, earthquakes, and pyroclastic storms that obliterated entire settlements. The human population survived through a combination of technological knowledge preserved from their ancestors and an indomitable will to endure. They lived in 7 sanctuary cities built to withstand the planet's fury, and between the times of trial, they hunted and gathered resources from the ash wastes, always preparing for the next cataclysm. The infant Primarch crashed into this unforgiving world and was found by a blacksmith named Bel in the settlement that would later be known as Hesiod. Unlike some of his brothers who faced immediate hardship or were raised by animals, Vulkan grew among humans who taught him their values from the beginning. Bel raised the foundling as his own son, teaching him the art of metalworking and instilling in him the Nocturnian philosophy that strength existed to protect those who could not protect themselves. The culture of Nocturne emphasized self-reliance born from necessity, but never at the expense of community bonds. When the time of trial came, the strong helped the weak survive, and craftsmen like Bel were valued not for creating weapons of conquest but tools of survival. Vulkan's physical development far outpaced any normal human child, and by the time he reached maturity, he stood larger than any man on Nocturne. His skin darkened to obsidian black from the planet's intense radiation, his eyes burned with a deep red glow, and his strength allowed him to work metal that would have required teams of lesser smiths. He became known throughout the settlements as a master artificer whose creations were unmatched in quality and durability. More importantly, he used his abilities to help his people, forging tools and weapons that helped them survive the harsh environment, and personally leading rescue efforts when volcanic activity threatened outlying settlements. The Emperor's arrival on Nocturne occurred during the Great Crusade as his fleet moved through the Segmentum Ultima, bringing worlds into compliance and searching for his lost sons. The psychic beacon of a Primarch's soul was unmistakable to the Emperor's senses, and he descended to Nocturne knowing he would find one of his gene sons. What followed was not a simple reunion, but a test that reflected the culture Vulkan had adopted as his own. The Emperor, appearing as a stranger of obvious power and authority, challenged Vulkan to a series of contests that would prove his worthiness not through conquest or domination, but through skill, endurance, and mastery of craft. The first contest involved hunting and slaying the largest salamander on Nocturne. These massive reptilian creatures, from which the planet took part of its name, were apex predators that dwelt in the deepest volcanic regions. They grew to enormous size, their scales hardened by constant exposure to extreme heat, and they possessed a cunning that made them extraordinarily dangerous prey. Vulkan and the Emperor ventured into the most treacherous regions of the ash wastes, tracking the beasts through lava tubes and across fields of cooling magma. The contest tested not merely martial prowess but patience, tracking ability and understanding of the prey's nature. The exact outcome of this hunt varies in different accounts, with some suggesting Vulkan succeeded in bringing down a larger specimen, while others indicate the Emperor matched his achievement, demonstrating that even in the environment where Vulkan had spent his entire life, he faced an equal. The second contest centered on the forge, the place where Vulkan had spent countless hours perfecting his craft. The challenge was to create the finest weapon, with each competitor given access to the same materials and tools. For Vulkan, this was more than a test of technical skill. It represented everything Bel had taught him about patience, precision, and the philosophy that a true craftsman imbued his work with purpose beyond mere function. Both smiths worked through the night, hammer blows ringing across the settlement as the inhabitants gathered to witness this extraordinary competition. Vulkan poured his knowledge of metallurgy, his understanding of molecular structures enhanced by his Primarch's intellect, and his artistic vision into creating a weapon of exceptional balance and deadly efficiency. When both weapons were completed and examined, the craftsmanship displayed by both competitors astounded the onlookers, though again, the sources differ on which creation was judged superior. Additional trials followed, each designed to test different aspects of Vulkan's abilities and character. These contests were not about humiliating or dominating the Primarch, but about understanding the man he had become and demonstrating that the Emperor recognized the value of the culture that had shaped him. Unlike some reunions between the Emperor and his sons that involved the Primarch immediately submitting to superior force or being awed by revelation of their true nature, Vulkan's discovery involved mutual respect earned through demonstrated excellence. When the Emperor finally revealed his true identity and explained Vulkan's origins, the Primarch faced a choice that would define his future. He could remain on Nocturne as its greatest protector and craftsman, or he could join the Great Crusade and lead the 18th Legion that had been created from his genetic template. Vulkan chose to leave with his father, but he did not abandon Nocturne or its values. Instead, he carried them forward, transforming the 18th Legion into the Salamanders and instilling in them the principles he had learned in Enbel's Forge. What set Vulkan apart from his brother Primarchs, beyond his exceptional skill as an artificer, was his nature as a Perpetual. This condition meant that Vulkan could not truly die. When his body suffered fatal damage, he would eventually regenerate and return to life. The exact source of this ability remains a subject of speculation among those few who know of it. Some believe it was an intentional aspect of his creation, a failsafe the Emperor built into at least one of his sons. Others suggest it might have been an unexpected result of the specific gene craft that went into Vulkan's design, or perhaps something that emerged from the circumstances of his gestation and scattering. The perpetual nature was not a simple regeneration or enhanced healing factor that several Primarchs possessed to varying degrees. It was something more fundamental, a quality that bound Vulkan's essence to existence itself in a way that made true death impossible. This did not make him invincible in battle. He could be wounded, incapacitated, and even killed in the conventional sense. The difference was that death was not permanent for him, though the time required for resurrection could vary dramatically depending on the severity of the damage and circumstances of his demise. This immortality was not widely known, even among the Salamanders' Legion. Vulkan himself seemed to discover its nature gradually, and it would become relevant primarily during the Horus Heresy and its aftermath. The ability distinguished him fundamentally from his brothers, who, despite their superhuman resilience and longevity, could be permanently killed. This difference would become central to the prophecies and beliefs that developed around Vulkan's eventual return to the Imperium. Vulkan's skills as a master artificer manifested in the creation of artifacts that became legendary within the Salamanders' Legion and beyond. He did not simply forge weapons and armor. He created works that combined functionality with artistry, items that would endure for millennia and whose properties sometimes seemed to transcend mere craftsmanship. These artifacts, which would later be known as the Artifacts of Vulkan or the Engines of War, included items such as the Spear of Vulkan, the Kesser's Mantle, and others whose names and purposes were recorded in the most sacred texts of the Salamanders. Each artifact represented not just Vulkan's technical mastery, but his philosophy of creation. He believed that items of power should serve purposes beyond destruction, that they should embody the values of protection and endurance. The care he took in their creation, the materials he selected, and the techniques he employed made these objects nearly indestructible and capable of functioning across millennia without degradation. These artifacts would later become central to the prophecies surrounding his return, with the belief developing among the Salamanders that recovering all of these items would herald or enable their Primarch's comeback to lead them once more. The influence of Nocturne on Vulkan's character cannot be overstated. While other Primarchs became conquerors, administrators, or warriors defined primarily by their martial prowess, Vulkan remained fundamentally shaped by the values of a death world craftsman. He understood that true strength meant protecting those weaker than yourself, that survival required community and cooperation, and that creation was as important as destruction. These principles made him unusual among the Primarchs, some of whom viewed such concerns as weaknesses or distractions from the Great Crusade's martial objectives. When Vulkan took command of the 18th Legion, he found warriors who shared his genetic legacy but not his values. The Space Marines created from his gene seed had fought across the galaxy during the early decades of the Great Crusade, earning battle honors and bringing worlds into compliance through the standard methods of the Legion's Astartes. They were effective soldiers, disciplined and capable, but they lacked the distinctive character that would come to define them. Vulkan's transformation of his Legion went beyond simply taking command. He fundamentally reshaped their culture, their approach to warfare, and their understanding of why they fought. The Promethean cult emerged from this transformation, though calling it merely a cult understates its significance within Salamander's culture. It functioned as philosophy, religious framework, and practical guide simultaneously. At its core lay principles that Vulkan had learned on Nocturne, adapted for warriors who would fight across the galaxy rather than simply survive on a single death world. The cult's name derived from Prometheus, Nocturne's moon whose gravitational influence brought the time of trial, representing both destruction and the opportunity for rebirth through endurance. Self-sacrifice stood as the first and most fundamental doctrine. The Promethean cult taught that a salamander's life belonged not to himself, but to humanity. This was not the grim fatalism that characterized some other legions' attitudes toward death in battle. Instead, it emphasized conscious choice and the willingness to bear any burden if doing so protected those who could not protect themselves. A salamander who threw himself onto a grenade to save civilians acted not from suicidal impulse, but from calculated recognition that his enhanced physiology gave him better survival odds than unaugmented humans, and even if he died, that death had purpose. This doctrine created warriors who viewed their superhuman abilities not as proof of superiority, but as tools that came with responsibility. The concept of the Promethean fire formed the second pillar of the cult's teachings. Fire served as both literal and metaphorical element in Salamander's philosophy. Literally, the Legion showed preference for flame weapons, with flamers, melt-a-guns, and thermal weaponry appearing throughout their armory in greater proportion than in other legions. The Salamanders became experts in urban warfare and close-quarters combat, where such weapons proved most effective. They learned to use fire not merely as a weapon of destruction, but as a tool of purification and renewal. A city corrupted by Xeno's influence burned, but from those ashes, human civilization could rebuild cleanly. Metaphorically, the Promethean fire represented the trials that forged character and revealed truth. Just as metal required heating, hammering, and quenching to achieve its final form, warriors required testing through hardship to become what they were meant to be. The Salamanders embraced this concept of refinement through suffering. They did not seek out hardship for its own sake, but when it came, they viewed it as opportunity for growth rather than mere obstacle. This philosophy made them exceptionally resilient in extended campaigns, where other forces might have broken under accumulated stress and losses. The third fundamental doctrine addressed the protection of humanity above all other concerns. This principle distinguished the Salamanders from legions that prioritized victory regardless of collateral damage or viewed civilian casualties as acceptable costs of warfare. Vulkan taught his sons that the Great Crusade's purpose was not conquest, but the preservation and uplift of human civilization. Every world brought into compliance, every Xenos threat eliminated, every heretical cult purged served this larger goal. When tactical situations forced choices between military efficiency and civilian safety, the Salamanders consistently chose the latter, even when it meant accepting higher casualties among their own forces or allowing enemies to escape rather than pursuing them through populated areas. This doctrine created tension with other legions and imperial commanders who viewed such concerns as impediments to effective warfare. The Salamanders gained reputation for being slow and methodical, for taking longer to achieve compliance than more aggressive legions. Critics pointed to battles where a more ruthless approach would have achieved victory faster and with fewer Space Marine casualties. Vulkan and his sons endured such criticism without changing their methods, secure in their understanding that speed of conquest meant nothing if it left behind traumatized populations or destroyed the infrastructure necessary for those worlds to contribute to the Imperium. The 7 trials of the Fire Drakes represented the Promethean cult's principles in practical application. The Fire Drakes formed the first company, the Legion's elite veterans, who served as Vulkan's personal guard and the example to which all other Salamanders aspired. Achieving Fire Drake status required more than battlefield excellence or years of service. A Salamander had to complete 7 specific trials that tested different aspects of character and capability. The exact nature of these trials was not standardized. Each aspirant's trials were tailored to test his specific weaknesses and force him to grow beyond current limitations. The trials typically included tests of endurance, where the aspirant had to survive conditions that would kill unaugmented humans and severely challenge even Space Marine physiology. One common trial involved entering active volcanic chambers on Nocturne, enduring extreme heat and toxic gases while accomplishing specific objectives. Another tested the aspirant's craftsmanship, requiring him to forge an item of exceptional quality under time pressure or adverse conditions. This connected to the Legion's broader emphasis on artifice and creation, reminding warriors that they were builders as well as destroyers. Other trials examined judgment and moral character. An aspirant might be placed in simulated or actual situations where he had to choose between tactical advantage and civilian safety, where following orders conflicted with the Promethean cult's principles, or where he had to determine the proper response to morally ambiguous situations. These trials had no predetermined correct answers. Instead, they forced the aspirant to demonstrate that he understood the principles underlying the Promethean cult and could apply them even under extreme pressure when simpler, more brutal solutions presented themselves. The 7 trials established patterns that would become important when the Salamanders later sought Vulkan's artifacts. The trials taught that worthy goals required endurance through hardship, that shortcuts undermined the value of achievement, and that the journey of obtaining something mattered as much as the final possession. When the Legion eventually learned of the scattered artifacts and the prophecies surrounding them, they approached the quest with the same mindset cultivated through the Fire Drake trials. Each artifact required its own journey, its own tests, and rushing or cutting corners would defeat the purpose. The Salamanders' practice of maintaining ties with their families and communities on Nocturne marked another radical departure from standard Space Marine culture. Most chapters recruited aspirants, who then underwent complete separation from their former lives. The transformation into a Space Marine involved not just physical changes, but psychological conditioning that eliminated attachments to family, friends, and civilian identity. The new Space Marine was supposed to view his chapter as his only family, his battle brothers as his only meaningful relationships. Vulkan rejected this model. He had been raised by Enbel and never forgot the debt he owed to the blacksmith, who taught him not just craft but values. He saw no reason why his sons should forget the families and communities that produced them. The Salamanders recruited from Nocturne's population, and unlike other chapters that took aspirants and severed all contact with their origins, the Salamanders maintained those connections. A Salamander knew which sanctuary city he came from, who his parents were, and he was permitted and encouraged to visit them when circumstances allowed. This practice had practical effects on the Legion's character. Salamanders who maintained family connections retained clearer understanding of what they fought to protect. They saw humanity not as abstract concept, but as specific people with names and faces. When a Salamander returned to Nocturne between campaigns and spoke with his father about the harvest, or helped his sister repair her home's thermal shielding, he reinforced his connection to the baseline human experience. This prevented the sense of separation and superiority that affected some Space Marine chapters, where warriors began viewing themselves as so far removed from humanity that they forgot why humanity mattered. The practice also created unique dynamics within the Legion. Salamanders from the same sanctuary cities often formed bonds beyond just serving in the same squad or company. They shared knowledge of specific places, participated in the same cultural traditions, and sometimes even had family connections that predated their recruitment. This created additional layers of loyalty and mutual support within the Legion's structure. A Salamander fought not just for the Emperor and the Imperium, not just for his Primarch and Legion, but also for the specific communities on Nocturne that he knew personally. Critics of this practice argued that it created potential vulnerabilities. If enemies learned of a Salamander's family connections, those relatives could be targeted or used as leverage. Some Imperial commanders worried that such attachments might compromise a Space Marine's willingness to accept necessary casualties or make difficult strategic decisions. The Salamanders countered that these concerns misunderstood both the nature of their bonds and the strength of their training. A Salamander's love for his family did not make him weak. It clarified his purpose and strengthened his resolve. The knowledge that his family lived under the Imperium's protection motivated him to fight harder, not less effectively. The Tome of Fire served as the Promethean cult's central text, though text understates what it represented. Vulkan created it as both scripture and practical manual, combining philosophical teachings with technical information about warfare, craftsmanship, and survival. The tome existed in multiple copies, with the original remaining on Nocturne in the sanctuary of the Primarch, while other copies were distributed throughout the Legion. Each company maintained its own copy, and Salamanders were expected to study it regularly throughout their service. The tome's structure reflected its dual nature. Some sections read as philosophical treatises, exploring concepts like the balance between destruction and protection, the relationship between individual and community, or the meaning of sacrifice. These passages used metaphor and allegory drawn from Nocturne's environment, with volcanic eruptions representing both catastrophic destruction and the renewal that followed, with the time of trial serving as reminder that hardship revealed character. Other sections provided practical instruction. The tome included detailed information about working with various metals and materials, techniques for creating weapons and armor, and methods for maintaining equipment under adverse conditions. It contained tactical doctrines specific to the Salamanders' preferred methods of warfare, with particular emphasis on urban combat, defensive operations, and situations requiring protection of civilians or infrastructure. The tome taught how to use thermal weapons effectively, how to fight in extreme heat or toxic environments, and how to turn environmental hazards into tactical advantages. The balance between Destroyer's flame and Protector's duty formed one of the tome's central themes. Vulkan understood that his sons were weapons, created and trained to bring death to the Emperor's enemies. He did not shy from this reality, or pretend that Space Marines were primarily humanitarian workers who occasionally fought. The Salamanders were warriors, and they needed to be effective at destruction. The tome taught methods of killing efficiently and thoroughly when necessary. However, it also taught that destruction was never an end in itself. The flame that burned away corruption also cauterized wounds and prevented infection from spreading. The hammer that shattered enemy fortifications was the same tool that shaped metal into useful forms. Every act of destruction should serve constructive purpose, and warriors should never forget that their ultimate goal was building and protecting civilization, not simply tearing down enemies. This philosophy manifested in how Salamanders approached warfare, always considering what would remain after battle ended, and whether their methods of achieving victory undermined the reasons for fighting. The Warmaster's betrayal shattered the Imperium in ways that went far beyond simple rebellion. When Horus turned against the Emperor, he brought with him nearly half the Space Marine legions, along with countless Imperial army regiments, Mechanicum forces, and entire sectors of human space. The opening moves of this civil war demonstrated a level of planning and coordination that revealed how long Horus had been preparing his treachery. The virus bombing of Istvan III eliminated loyalist elements within the traitor legions, and the subsequent massacre at Istvan V represented perhaps the single most devastating blow dealt to the Emperor's cause during the entire heresy. The Emperor dispatched 7 legions to bring Horus to account for the atrocity on Istvan III. Ferrus Manus led the Iron Hands as overall commander of the Loyalist force, joined by Vulkan and the Salamanders, Corax and the Raven Guard, along with 4 other legions that would provide the second wave of the assault. The plan called for the first 3 legions to make planetfall and engage Horus's forces directly, establishing a beachhead that the second wave would reinforce. The strategy was sound by conventional military logic, but it failed to account for the depth of the conspiracy that Horus had woven. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Word-Bearers made up the second wave. These legions had shown no signs of corruption or disloyalty, and their Primarchs had maintained apparently cordial relations with both the Emperor and the War Master. When they arrived in system and began their approach to reinforce the first wave, nothing in their communications or movements suggested anything other than loyal service. The truth became apparent only when the moment of maximum vulnerability arrived. The drop site assault began with the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard making combat drops into the Urgal Depression, a vast plain of black sand surrounded by ridges that provided the traitors with excellent defensive positions. The sons of Horus, World Eaters, Death Guard, and Emperor's children had fortified these ridges, creating killing fields that the Loyalists would have to cross under constant fire. Ferrus Manus drove his forces forward with characteristic aggression, determined to close with the enemy quickly and negate their defensive advantages through brutal close-quarters combat. Vulkan led his Salamanders with more caution, advancing methodically and maintaining cohesion even under heavy fire. The Primarch stood head and shoulders above even his Gene sons, his obsidian skin and burning eyes making him instantly recognizable across the battlefield. He wielded his hammer Dawnbringer, an artifact of his own creation that could shatter ceramite with single blows, and he personally led assaults on traitor strongpoints when doing so would save his sons' lives. The Salamanders fought as they had been trained, using their thermal weapons to maximum effect, and prioritizing the protection of their battle brothers even as they pressed the attack. The fighting was brutal from the start. The traitor legions had prepared their positions well, with overlapping fields of fire and kill zones designed to maximize casualties among the attackers. The Loyalists took heavy losses crossing the open ground, but their superior numbers and the fury of 3 Primarchs leading from the front began to tell. The traitor lines started to buckle in places, and it appeared that the first wave might actually achieve their objectives before the second wave even arrived. Then the second wave made planetfall. The dropships and landing craft of the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Word-Bearers descended toward the Urgal Depression, and the Loyalist forces prepared to exploit the reinforcement. Instead, these supposedly loyal legions opened fire on the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard from behind. The betrayal was total and coordinated, executed with precision that indicated extensive planning. The 4 traitor legions had positioned their landing zones to create perfect crossfire with the forces already engaging the Loyalists from the front. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard found themselves trapped in a vice. Ahead of them, the sons of Horus and their allies intensified their assault, no longer needing to conserve ammunition or maintain defensive positions. Behind them, 4 more legions poured fire into their rear ranks. The black sand of the Urgal Depression turned to mud as the blood of thousands of space marines soaked into it. The noise of the battle became deafening, a constant roar of bolter fire, explosions, and the screams of dying warriors. Ferrus Manus refused to retreat. The Iron Hands Primarch saw Fulgrim, his brother and once friend, among the traitor forces and charged toward him with a fury that overrode tactical sense. The Morlocks, his elite Terminator bodyguard, followed their Primarch into what became a fatal advance. Vulkan attempted to coordinate a fighting withdrawal, recognizing that the Loyalist position had become untenable, but the speed of the collapse and the chaos of battle made organized retreat nearly impossible. The Salamanders formed pockets of resistance, fighting back to back as traitors closed in from all sides. The death of Ferrus Manus broke whatever slim chance the Loyalists had of extracting significant forces. Fulgrim personally beheaded the Iron Hands Primarch, and the sight of their father's death sent many of the Iron Hands into berserk fury that made them easy targets. The Salamanders and Raven Guard tried to cover the Iron Hands' suicidal charges, but the weight of numbers against them made survival increasingly unlikely. Vulkan found himself separated from the main body of his legion, cut off by a surge of world eaters who threw themselves forward without regard for casualties. The Primarch fought with desperate strength, each swing of Dawnbringer crushing traitors who had once been brothers. His perpetual nature was unknown to most of those present, and he fought as any Primarch would when facing overwhelming odds, seeking to sell his life dearly and take as many enemies with him as possible. The traitors recognized him as a priority target, and squads converged on his position. Vulkan killed dozens, his hammer pulping power armor and the flesh within it, but even a Primarch could be worn down by sufficient numbers and firepower. The exact circumstances of Vulkan's fall remain unclear in the historical record. Some accounts suggest he was buried under rubble when an orbital bombardment struck near his position. Others indicate that massed fire from heavy weapons finally brought him down. What is certain is that Vulkan fell during the massacre, his body disappearing in the chaos of the battle. The Salamanders who survived the initial betrayal assumed their Primarch had died, and this belief compounded the trauma of the day's losses. The Night Lords recovered Vulkan's body from the battlefield. Whether they specifically sought him, or simply found him among the dead and wounded is unclear, but Conrad Kurz recognized the opportunity that possessing a brother Primarch's corpse represented. The Night Lords withdrew from Istvan V with their prize, and Vulkan's ordeal truly began when he regenerated in the custody of the most sadistic of all the traitor Primarchs. Kurz had long since descended into madness, his visions of the future and his conviction that the universe was fundamentally cruel and unjust, warping his personality beyond recognition. He ruled his legion through terror and maintained discipline through methods that other Primarchs found disturbing even before the heresy. The Night Haunter, as he called himself, believed that fear was the only effective tool for controlling human behavior, and he had developed torture and psychological warfare into art forms. When Vulkan revived aboard the Night Lord's flagship Nightfall, he found himself in a nightmare. Kurz had placed him in specially prepared cells designed to contain a Primarch, though even these proved barely adequate. The Night Haunter did not simply imprison Vulkan. He subjected him to systematic torture designed to break the Salamander's Primarch psychologically and prove Kurz's nihilistic philosophy. The Night Lord's Primarch believed that anyone could be reduced to a monster through sufficient suffering, that the veneer of civilization and morality was paper-thin, and that Vulkan's compassion and humanity were delusions that torture would strip away. Kurz killed Vulkan repeatedly. He used blades, fire, crushing, suffocation, and countless other methods, each death designed to be as agonizing as possible. The Night Haunter would kill his brother, wait for the regeneration to complete, and then begin again. Between these murders, Kurz engaged in psychological torture, describing in detail the atrocities the Night Lords committed, explaining how Vulkan's compassion was weakness, and arguing that the universe's fundamental cruelty made concepts like honor and protection meaningless. The perpetual nature that made Vulkan unique among his brothers became the source of unprecedented suffering. A normal Primarch, if captured and killed, would at least find release in death. Vulkan could not escape through death. Each time Kurz killed him, he returned to consciousness to face more torture. The psychological impact of dying repeatedly, of experiencing the moment of death over and over, would have broken lesser beings immediately. Even for a Primarch, the strain accumulated with each cycle. Kurz employed methods that went beyond physical torture. He forced Vulkan to watch recordings of atrocities committed by the Night Lords, populations terrorized and slaughtered, cities burned not for strategic purpose but purely to spread fear. The Night Haunter described these acts in loving detail, explaining the psychology of terror and how effectively it controlled populations. He argued that Vulkan's methods of protection and compassion were inefficient, that fear achieved compliance more reliably than hope, and that the Emperor himself understood this truth but lacked the courage to fully embrace it. The imprisonment lasted for an extended period, though the exact duration is difficult to establish. Time became meaningless for Vulkan in the darkness of his cells, with only the cycles of death and resurrection marking its passage. The isolation compounded the torture. Vulkan had no contact with his legion, no knowledge of how the heresy progressed, no way to fulfill his purpose of protecting humanity. The helplessness aided him as much as the physical torment. Kur's ultimate goal seemed to be proving that Vulkan could be broken, that sufficient suffering would transform the compassionate Primarch into something as monstrous as the Night Haunter himself. The torture was designed to strip away Vulkan's humanity, to make him embrace cruelty as the only rational response to a cruel universe. The Night Haunter wanted to demonstrate that the difference between himself and Vulkan was merely circumstance, that given enough suffering, any being would become what Kur's had become. Vulkan resisted. Despite everything Kur's did to him, despite dying dozens or possibly hundreds of times, despite the psychological warfare and forced witnessing of atrocities, Vulkan maintained his core identity. He refused to accept Kur's philosophy, refused to believe that cruelty was the universe's fundamental nature, and refused to abandon his conviction that protection and compassion had meaning. This resistance infuriated the Night Haunter, who escalated his torments in increasingly desperate attempts to achieve the breaking point he sought. The arrival of John Grammaticus changed the equation. Grammaticus was himself a Perpetual, an ancient being who had lived for millennia and served various powers throughout human history. During the Heresy, he became involved with the Cabal, a group of Xenos who believed they understood how to end the threat of chaos. Grammaticus had his own complex motivations and allegiances, but he recognized that Vulkan's continued imprisonment served no purpose except satisfying Kur's madness. The exact details of how Grammaticus infiltrated the Nightfall and reached Vulkan's cell remain known only to those directly involved. The Perpetual possessed abilities that allowed him to move through the Night Lord's ship despite its security measures and the paranoia of its crew. When he reached Vulkan, he found a Primarch who had endured torments that would have destroyed any normal being's sanity, but who somehow remained fundamentally himself. Grammaticus provided Vulkan with the means to escape, though the process was neither simple nor clean. The two Perpetuals fought their way through sections of the Nightfall, with Vulkan's fury at his captivity making him a devastating force, even weakened, as he was from prolonged torture. The Night Lords responded to the escape attempt, and the fighting aboard the ship became vicious. Vulkan killed every Night Lord who stood between him and freedom, his hammer Dawnbringer having been recovered during the escape, and the Primarch showed no mercy to those who had participated in his torture. The escape succeeded, though at significant cost. Vulkan and Grammaticus managed to reach an escape craft and flee the Nightfall before Kur's could recapture them. The Night Haunter's rage at losing his prize was reportedly apocalyptic, and he took his fury out on those Night Lords he deemed responsible for allowing the escape. For Vulkan, freedom brought relief but not healing. The psychological wounds inflicted during his imprisonment would never fully close. The trauma of the imprisonment affected Vulkan profoundly. He had faced death repeatedly, experienced helplessness while his legion fought without him, and been forced to confront the depths of cruelty that his brothers were capable of inflicting. The experience reinforced his existing beliefs about the importance of compassion and protection, but it also left scars that influenced his later actions. The Vulkan who escaped from Kur's was changed from the Primarch who had fallen at Istvan V, and these changes would shape his choices in the years that followed. The Nightfall represented everything the Night Lords had become under Conrad Kur's leadership. The flagship was not merely a vessel of war, but a monument to terror, its corridors decorated with the remains of those who had displeased the Night Haunter, or simply had the misfortune to be available when he needed to make an example. The ship's architecture reflected its master's psychology, with sections designed specifically for inflicting suffering. Deep within this floating charnel house, Kur's had prepared chambers intended to hold a being of Primarch-level durability, though even he had not initially understood just how thoroughly he would need to test those preparations. When Vulkan first regained consciousness aboard the Nightfall, he found himself restrained with chains that would have held a dreadnought in place. The cell was bare except for the implements Kur's had assembled for his work. The Night Haunter stood waiting, his pale features twisted in what might have been anticipation or satisfaction. Kur's had always been the most visibly inhuman of the Primarchs in appearance, his sunken eyes and corpse-like pallor marking him as something wrong even before considering his actions. He regarded his captured brother with an expression that combined scientific curiosity with sadistic pleasure. The first death came quickly, almost experimentally. Kurz used a blade forged from some dark metal that seemed to drink in light, and he opened Vulkan's throat with a precision that spoke to his intimate knowledge of Primarch physiology. The Salamander's Primarch died with his brother's face, the last thing he saw, and Kurz settled in to wait and observe what would happen. The Night Haunter had suspected something unusual about Vulkan based on fragments of intelligence and his own precognitive visions, but he had not known the full extent of his brother's perpetual nature. The regeneration took hours. Flesh knitted itself back together through processes that defied conventional understanding of biology. The wound closed, blood that had spilled across the cell floor seemed to flow back into Vulkan's body, and eventually his eyes opened again. Kurz leaned forward, studying every detail of the resurrection. When Vulkan's awareness fully returned, and he realized he was still imprisoned, still in his brother's power, the despair that crossed his features clearly delighted the Night Haunter. Kurz began speaking then, his voice carrying the peculiar quality of someone who had long since abandoned any pretense of sanity, but retained full intellectual capacity. He explained what he intended to do, how he would kill Vulkan repeatedly until he understood the truth about the universe's nature. The Night Haunter had developed an entire philosophy around suffering and terror, and he viewed Vulkan as the perfect test subject. Here was a brother who represented everything Kurz despised: compassion, hope, the belief that protection and creation mattered. The Night Haunter would prove these beliefs were delusions by demonstrating that sufficient pain could break anyone. The second death involved fire. Kurz had his legion bring flamers into the cell and immolate Vulkan while he was still chained. The irony was not lost on either Primarch. Vulkan's legion specialized in thermal weapons, and the Salamander's Primarch had spent his life working with forge fires. Now that element which had defined so much of his identity became the instrument of his execution. The flames consumed him slowly, and Kurz watched every moment of his brother's agony before the body finally expired. Between deaths, during the periods when Vulkan regenerated or after he had returned to consciousness, Kurz engaged in what he clearly viewed as philosophical discourse. The Night Haunter spoke about their father, the Emperor, and the vision he claimed to have for humanity. Kurz argued that the Emperor understood the necessity of terror, but lacked the will to fully embrace it. He pointed to the Thunder Warrior's Purge, to the burning of the last church on Terra, to the countless acts of violence the Emperor had ordered or permitted during the Unification Wars and Great Crusade. These actions, Kurz insisted, proved that the Emperor knew the truth about power and control, but surrounded himself with sons like Vulkan, who clung to comfortable lies about honor and protection. Vulkan rejected these arguments even as his body healed from whatever method Kurz had most recently employed to kill him. The Salamander's Primarch maintained that the violence of the Great Crusade served a purpose beyond itself, that bringing humanity together under the Imperial truth and protecting it from Xeno's threats and the predations of Old Knight's legacy justified temporary brutality. He argued that Kurz had mistaken the means for the end, that terror might achieve compliance but created nothing worth protecting. The debate continued through cycles of death and resurrection, with neither Primarch yielding ground. The third death came from depressurization. Kurz had sections of the Nightfall modified so he could expose Vulkan to the void. The Salamander's Primarch experienced the horrific process of dying in vacuum, his enhanced physiology fighting desperately to maintain function as pressure differential tore at his body, and the absolute cold of space froze his tissues. This death took longer than the previous ones, and Kurz observed with clinical interest how long a Primarch could survive such exposure before final cessation occurred. The Night Haunter varied his methods with each killing, exploring different approaches as if conducting research. He used toxins that would have killed entire companies of space marines, injecting them directly into Vulkan's bloodstream and watching how the Primarch's enhanced metabolism struggled against poisons designed to kill beings far less resilient. He employed crushing, placing Vulkan under weights that slowly compressed his body until bones shattered and organs ruptured. He tried suffocation, sealing his brother in chambers filled with inert gases or toxic fumes. Each death chipped away at Vulkan's mental stability. The experience of dying was not something any consciousness was designed to process repeatedly. The moment when awareness faded, when the body's systems shut down and darkness closed in, left psychological scars that accumulated with each iteration. Vulkan found himself anticipating the deaths, dreading the moment when Kurz would enter the cell with new instruments or simply his bare hands. The fear of the next death became its own form of torture, and the Night Haunter cultivated this fear deliberately. The psychological warfare extended beyond the physical torments. Kurz had his legion bring recordings and picked captures of atrocities committed during the heresy. He showed Vulkan images of worlds burning, populations fleeing in terror from Night Lord's raids, cities reduced to charnel houses. The Night Haunter provided running commentary on these displays, explaining the tactical and strategic reasoning behind each act of terror. He described how fear paralyzed resistance, how populations that witnessed sufficient brutality became docile, how the threat of terrible punishment prevented rebellion more effectively than any amount of benevolent governance. Vulkan was forced to watch as the heresy progressed without him. He saw evidence of battles where the Salamanders fought without their Primarch, taking casualties that his presence might have prevented. The helplessness compounded his suffering. He was not simply enduring torture in isolation. He was watching his legion bleed while he remained imprisoned, unable to fulfill his fundamental purpose of protecting his sons and the wider Imperium. Kurz understood this psychological dimension and exploited it ruthlessly. The Night Haunter spoke extensively about their respective childhoods and how environment shaped character. He described his own upbringing in Nostromo's criminal underworld, how he had witnessed every form of human depravity before he was old enough to understand what he was seeing. Kurz argued that Nocturne's harsh environment was not fundamentally different from Nostromo's urban hell. Both were places where the strong preyed on the weak, where survival required ruthlessness. The only difference, he insisted, was that Vulkan had been fortunate enough to be found by a kind blacksmith instead of having to survive alone among criminals and murderers. Vulkan countered that choice mattered more than circumstance. He acknowledged that Kurz had faced terrible conditions, but he refused to accept that those conditions had made the Night Haunter's descent into sadistic madness inevitable. Vulkan pointed out that other Primarchs had faced harsh environments and emerged without becoming monsters. The Salamanders' Primarch maintained that Kurz had chosen to embrace cruelty, that he had allowed his visions of dark futures to become self-fulfilling prophecies by acting as if the worst outcomes were inevitable. These debates grew more heated as the imprisonment continued. Kurz became increasingly frustrated by Vulkan's refusal to break, to admit that the Night Haunter's philosophy was correct. The torture escalated in response to this frustration. Where earlier deaths had been relatively quick, Kurz began extending the process. He found ways to keep Vulkan alive and conscious while inflicting injuries that should have killed him immediately, using his knowledge of Primarch physiology to prolong suffering. The reactor core incident represented the culmination of Kurz's escalating brutality. The Nightfall's main plasma reactor generated temperatures and radiation levels that could vaporize most materials instantly. Kurz had his sons drag Vulkan to the reactor chamber and throw him directly into the core. The Salamander's Primarch experienced death by immolation on a scale that dwarfed any previous killing. His body was consumed by energies that could power a vessel capable of faster-than-light travel. The pain lasted only moments before his nervous system was completely destroyed, but those moments contained agony beyond description. The resurrection from this death took significantly longer. Kurz waited days before Vulkan's body reformed from the scattered atoms and energy patterns that remained. The Night Haunter used this time to reflect on what he was witnessing. Even he, who had killed thousands in increasingly creative ways, found something unsettling about the perpetual nature. It suggested that the universe operated according to rules he did not fully understand, that there were forces at work beyond even a Primarch's comprehension. When Vulkan returned to consciousness after the reactor core death, something had changed. The accumulated trauma of repeated deaths, combined with the particularly horrific nature of this latest execution, had pushed him to a psychological breaking point. He did not break in the way Kurz wanted, did not embrace cruelty or abandon his principles. Instead, he retreated inward, becoming less responsive to his brother's taunts and arguments. The Vulkan who had engaged in philosophical debate was replaced by a being focused entirely on endurance, on surviving each moment without thought for anything beyond the immediate present. Kurz recognized this change and initially believed he had achieved his goal. He thought he had broken Vulkan's spirit and reduced him to a state where higher concepts like compassion and duty no longer registered. The Night Haunter grew less interested in his captive, viewing the experiment as essentially complete. This shift in attention created the opportunity that would eventually lead to Vulkan's escape, though neither Primarch realized it at the time. The Cabal's interest in Vulkan stemmed from their broader involvement in the Heresy's events. This organization of ancient Xeno species had developed their own understanding of how chaos could be defeated, and they had identified certain individuals as crucial to their plans. John Grammaticus served as one of their agents, though his loyalty to the Cabal was complicated by his own agenda and his nature as a Perpetual. When the Cabal learned that Vulkan was imprisoned aboard the Nightfall and that he shared Grammaticus's perpetual nature, they recognized potential significance in this situation. Grammaticus infiltrated the Nightfall using abilities and resources provided by the Cabal. His perpetual nature gave him advantages in surviving the dangerous environment of a Night Lord's vessel, and his centuries of experience in covert operations allowed him to navigate the ship's corridors without detection. When he finally reached the section where Kurz kept Vulkan, he found a Primarch who had endured torments that would have destroyed any normal being's sanity dozens of times over. The escape required careful timing and significant violence. Grammaticus provided Vulkan with information about the ship's layout and the location where his war gear, including Dawnbringer, was being kept as a trophy. The two Perpetuals moved through the Nightfall, and when Night Lords discovered them, Vulkan's fury at his imprisonment made him devastating despite his weakened state. He killed with his bare hands when necessary, crushing power armored warriors and tearing through bulkheads when they stood between him and freedom. The fighting drew attention throughout the ship, and Kurz realized what was happening too late to prevent it. The Night Haunter rushed toward the section where he had kept Vulkan, but the Salamanders Primarch and Grammaticus had already reached an escape craft. The launch bay's defenses tried to prevent their departure, but Vulkan's strength and determination overcame these obstacles. The small vessel fled the Nightfall and entered the warp before the Night Lords could destroy it or recapture their escaped prisoner. The escape from the Nightfall left Vulkan physically free, but psychologically scarred in ways that would never fully heal. He made his way back to Imperial space through routes that remain unclear in the historical record, eventually reuniting with the remnants of his legion. The Salamanders had continued fighting throughout the Heresy without their Primarch, taking terrible casualties at Istvan V and in subsequent campaigns. The reunion between Vulkan and his sons was not the triumphant return that might have occurred under different circumstances. The Primarch who came back to them had been fundamentally changed by his ordeal, and though he resumed command, those closest to him recognized that something essential had been damaged. The final years of the Heresy saw Vulkan leading his legion in several campaigns, though he operated with less of the methodical patience that had characterized his earlier approach to warfare. The trauma of helplessness aboard the Nightfall seemed to drive him toward more aggressive action, as if making up for the time lost while imprisoned. The Salamanders fought in the reconquest of worlds that had fallen to the traitors, and Vulkan personally led assaults that other commanders might have delegated to subordinates. He was present during the final stages of the Siege of Terra, though the Salamanders arrived too late to participate in the decisive confrontations within the Imperial Palace. After the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne and the beginning of what would become known as the Scouring, Vulkan continued leading his legion in hunting down traitor forces that had fled Terra's system. The Salamanders participated in campaigns to reclaim worlds in the Segmentum Solar, burning out traitor holdouts and securing the approaches to Terra. Vulkan's behavior during this period showed increasing signs of the psychological damage he had sustained. He would sometimes fall into periods of withdrawn silence or display sudden bursts of fury that seemed disproportionate to the tactical situation. His sons learned to recognize these moods and adjust their approach accordingly, but the changes troubled the Legion's senior officers. The exact timeline of when Vulkan disappeared following the heresy remains disputed among Imperial historians. Some accounts place his departure in the early years of the Scouring, while others suggest he remained with the Legion for decades afterward. What is certain is that at some point during the 31st millennium, Vulkan left his Legion without explanation. He did not die in battle or fall to enemy action. He simply departed Nocturne, leaving behind only fragmentary records that suggested he had gone to seek something or complete some task he would not explain even to his closest sons. Before his departure, Vulkan created a series of artifacts that would become central to Salamander's culture and belief. These were not the weapons and equipment he had forged earlier in his career, but specific items imbued with significance beyond their practical function. He scattered these artifacts across various locations, some on Nocturne itself and others on distant worlds. The Primarch left instructions that these items should be sought and recovered, though he did not explain why or what their recovery would accomplish. This mysterious departure and the quest for the artifacts became foundational elements of Salamander's tradition. The centuries following Vulkan's disappearance saw the Salamanders transform from a legion into a chapter as part of Guilliman's reforms. They maintained their connection to Nocturne and their adherence to the Promethean cult's principles. The search for Vulkan's artifacts became a sacred duty, with each recovered item carefully preserved in the sanctuary of the Primarch on Nocturne. The chapter developed prophecies and beliefs around these artifacts, interpreting fragmentary records and statements Vulkan had made before his departure as evidence that recovering all of them would herald his return. The 32nd millennium brought new challenges to an Imperium still recovering from the heresy's devastation. The imperial institutions that would define the next 10,000 years were still taking shape, with the administratum, ecclesiarchy, and other organizations establishing the bureaucratic frameworks that would govern humanity's scattered domains. The Space Marine legions had been broken into chapters, the Imperial Army had been reorganized into the Astra Militarum and Imperial Navy, and the Mechanicus had solidified its autonomy while maintaining ties to Terra. This was an Imperium finding its footing after nearly being destroyed, still vulnerable to threats that a more established government might have weathered more easily. The Orc species represented a constant threat throughout Imperial history, their aggressive nature and ability to reproduce rapidly making them impossible to fully eliminate. Orc invasions occurred regularly across the Imperium's borders, with wars of varying sizes erupting whenever a sufficiently powerful warboss managed to unite enough greenskin clans. Most of these invasions could be contained and destroyed through standard Imperial military responses, but occasionally, an Orc leader emerged who posed threats on a completely different scale. The beast represented such a threat, magnified to a degree that the Imperium had not faced since the Emperor himself had led the crusade against the Orc Empire of Ulanor. Around the year 544 of the 32nd millennium, reports began reaching Terra of an Orc threat emerging in the segmentum obscurus that defied normal patterns. The Greenskins were not simply raiding or conquering individual worlds. They were building, organizing, and deploying technology that approached or even exceeded human capabilities in some areas. Orc attack moons, massive planetoids converted into mobile weapons platforms, began appearing in Imperial space. These constructions demonstrated engineering sophistication that contradicted everything the Imperium understood about Orc capabilities. The attack moons represented technological achievements that seemed impossible for Greenskins to accomplish. Each moon was a world-sized weapon system, capable of independent warp travel, mounting batteries that could reduce planets to molten slag, and carrying Orc populations numbering in the billions. The moons appeared throughout the segmentum obscurus, and Imperial forces that engaged them discovered that conventional fleet actions were largely ineffective. The moon's size and the density of their armor plating allowed them to absorb damage that would have destroyed entire battle fleets, while their weapons could annihilate Imperial vessels from ranges that prevented effective retaliation. As the threat escalated, the Imperium discovered that it was not facing a single warboss, but rather multiple beings that the Orcs called the Beast. These prime Orcs stood larger than even the mightiest warbosses, approaching Primarch scale in their physical dimensions. They displayed intelligence and strategic thinking far beyond normal Orc capacity, coordinating their forces across multiple sectors and adapting their tactics in response to Imperial countermeasures. The Prime Orcs seemed to represent a form of greenskin development that the Imperium had not encountered in millennia, possibly not since the War of Ulanor during the Great Crusade. The Orc advance drove toward Terra itself with a directness that suggested genuine strategic planning rather than the opportunistic expansion typical of Waz. Imperial forces fought desperate defensive actions across dozens of systems, trying to slow the greenskin tide long enough for reinforcements to arrive and defensive lines to be established. The scale of the Orc forces overwhelmed many Imperial responses, with entire sectors falling to the greenskin advance in weeks or months. The attack moons served as mobile fortresses that the Orcs used to establish dominance over conquered systems, their presence making reconquest nearly impossible with conventional military forces. When an attack moon entered the Sol system itself and took up position within sight of Terra, the crisis reached its apex. The Orc vessel sat in orbit like a second moon, its weapons trained on humanity's throne world. The Beast's ambassador, an Orc capable of speaking Gothic and engaging in what passed for diplomatic discourse among greenskins, delivered an ultimatum demanding the Imperium's surrender. The psychological impact of seeing an Orc construct in Terra's sky, of having the species that humanity had fought for millennia demonstrate such capability and audacity, shook the Imperium's leadership. The High Lords of Terra faced a threat they were ill-equipped to handle. The institutional knowledge of how to fight wars on the scale of the Great Crusade had faded in the centuries since the heresy. The Space Marine chapters, limited by Guilliman's reforms to roughly 1,000 warriors each, lacked the overwhelming force that the old legions could have brought to bear. The Imperial Navy and Astra Militarum were still adapting to their new organizational structures. The Mechanicus had the technical knowledge to understand what the Orcs had accomplished, but not the military force to counter it directly. Multiple attempts to destroy the attack moon in orbit around Terra failed with heavy casualties. Space Marine chapters launched boarding actions that disappeared into the moon's interior without achieving their objectives. Imperial Navy battle groups engaged the moon's defenses and were annihilated. The Mechanicus deployed experimental weapons that proved ineffective against the moon's mass and armor. Each failure made the situation more desperate and the Imperium's vulnerability more apparent. In this darkest hour, Vulkan returned. The circumstances of his reappearance remain mysterious, with different accounts providing contradictory details. Some records suggest he simply walked out of the webway gate on Nocturne that the Salamanders had guarded for centuries. Others indicate he appeared on Terra itself without explanation of how he had traveled there. What matters is that the Primarch who had disappeared centuries earlier returned when the Imperium faced potential destruction, bringing with him knowledge and capabilities that would prove crucial in the war against the Beast. Vulkan's return galvanized the Imperial response. His presence provided both practical military leadership from a being who had fought in the Great Crusade and psychological reassurance that the Imperium was not truly abandoned by its greatest heroes. The Primarch immediately took command of Imperial forces, preparing for a counter-offensive against the Orc threat. He brought strategic understanding from an era when the Imperium had fought wars of galactic scale, and he adapted those lessons to the current crisis. The Salamanders chapter received their Primarch with joy tempered by the recognition that he had changed during his long absence. Vulkan was more withdrawn than the records suggested he had been during the Great Crusade, speaking little about where he had been or what he had done during the centuries away from his legion. He focused entirely on the immediate threat, studying reports of the Orc capabilities and developing plans to counter them. The Primarch's approach combined the methodical patience that had characterized his earlier career with a willingness to take risks that suggested he understood the desperate nature of the situation. Vulkan determined that conventional approaches to destroying the attack moons would not succeed. The moons were too large and too heavily armored to be destroyed by external assault. Instead, the Imperium needed to strike at their internal systems to sabotage the technology that allowed these massive constructs to function. This required boarding actions on a scale beyond what any single chapter could accomplish, and it demanded leadership capable of coordinating multiple Space Marine forces in an environment of unprecedented danger. The Primarch organized a coalition of Space Marine chapters for the assault on the attack moons. He brought together forces that included the Salamanders, Imperial Fists, and others, creating a strike force that approached Legion strength even if it did not match the numbers of the old legions. Vulkan's reputation and his status as one of the Emperor's own sons gave him authority that no other commander could have claimed. The Space Marines who joined his force understood they were following a living legend into battle against a threat that had already destroyed countless Imperial forces. The assault on the attack moons required penetrating their defenses, fighting through orc populations that numbered in the billions, and reaching the core systems that powered these massive constructs. Vulkan led from the front as he always had, his presence inspiring the Space Marines under his command and his combat abilities proving as devastating as they had been during the Great Crusade. The fighting inside the moons was brutal close-quarters combat in environments filled with orcs, where the greenskins' numbers and the confined spaces negated many Imperial tactical advantages. The confrontation with the beast itself occurred deep within one of the attack moons. Vulkan faced a prime orc that stood nearly as tall as he did, a creature whose physical power and combat instinct made it a legitimate threat even to a Primarch. The battle between them was savage, with Vulkan wielding Dawnbringer against an opponent whose strength and resilience exceeded anything normal orcs could achieve. The Prime Orc fought with a combination of raw power and tactical awareness that demonstrated why these beings had been able to threaten the Imperium so effectively. The details of how Vulkan defeated the beast are fragmentary, with surviving accounts providing only partial pictures of the confrontation. What is known is that the Primarch succeeded in killing the Prime Orc and destroying the systems that powered the attack moon, though at significant cost to the Imperial forces involved. The moon's destruction created a cascade effect that weakened the Orc offensive across multiple sectors, as the Greenskins' coordination broke down without the Prime Orc's leadership. The War of the Beast continued for some time after this victory, with Imperial forces gradually pushing back the Orc threat and reclaiming conquered territories. Vulkan participated in these campaigns, leading Imperial forces in assaults on remaining Orc strongholds. However, those who served with him during this period noted that the Primarch seemed increasingly distant, as if his attention was divided between the immediate military situation and some other concern he would not discuss. Following the defeat of the Beast and the neutralization of the immediate Orc threat, Vulkan returned to Nocturne. He spent time with the Salamanders chapter, meeting with its leadership, and apparently ensuring that certain traditions and knowledge would be preserved. The Primarch spoke cryptically about the future, making statements that his sons would later interpret as prophecies about his return. He emphasized the importance of the artifacts he had created and scattered, though he still did not fully explain their purpose or significance. Then Vulkan walked into the Webway Gate on Nocturne, the same gate that had stood on the planet since before the heresy. He left instructions that the gate should be guarded and maintained, and he entrusted his remaining artifacts to the chapter's care. The Primarch's final words to his sons suggested he would return when the Imperium faced its greatest need, though he provided no timeline or specific conditions for this return. He simply walked through the gate and disappeared, leaving the Salamanders to continue their vigil and wait for the day their father would come back to lead them once more. The Salamanders chapter maintains a belief that has sustained them through 10 millennia of warfare and loss. When all 9 artifacts created by Vulkan are recovered and returned to the Vault of Prometheus on Nocturne, their Primarch will return to lead them once more. This prophecy emerged from fragmentary statements Vulkan made before his final departure through the Webway Gate, combined with traditions passed down through generations of chapter leadership. The exact wording of the prophecy varies depending on which source within the chapter one consults, but the core concept remains consistent. The artifacts serve as keys, both literal and metaphorical, to Vulkan's return. Their recovery represents not just the reclamation of powerful relics, but the fulfillment of a sacred duty that spans the entirety of the chapter's post-heresy existence. The Vault of Prometheus itself stands as one of the most heavily guarded locations on Nocturne. Built into the volcanic rock of Mount Deathfire, the vault's construction incorporated techniques that Vulkan himself taught to the chapter's artificers. The entrance remains sealed by mechanisms that only the chapter master and the Forgefather, the title given to the salamander tasked with seeking the artifacts, can open. Inside, the vault contains chambers specifically prepared to house each of the 9 artifacts. With several already occupied by relics, the chapter has successfully recovered over the millennia. The vault's interior maintains precise environmental conditions to preserve the artifacts, though given their nature as works created by a Primarch, such preservation may be unnecessary. The Salamanders maintain these precautions regardless, viewing proper care of the artifacts as part of their sacred duty. The Spear of Vulkan, known also as the Spear of Nocturne in some records, represents one of the most significant artifacts both in terms of its power and its symbolic importance. The weapon stretches nearly twice the height of a space marine, its shaft forged from materials that resist analysis by even the most advanced Mechanicus instruments. The spearhead gleams with a dark metallic sheen that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the entire weapon radiates heat sufficient to be felt through ceramite gauntlets. Vulkan crafted this spear during the Great Crusade, and it served him in battles across numerous worlds. The weapon's balance is perfect despite its size, allowing a wielder of sufficient strength to use it with precision in close combat or to hurl it as a devastating projectile. The spear possesses the ability to pierce nearly any armor, with accounts from the Heresy describing it punching through Terminator plate as if it were unaugmented cloth. The Salamanders recovered this artifact from a world in the Segmentum Tempestus during the 38th millennium, after a lengthy campaign against an Orc-Wa that had overrun the planet. The spear had been held by a warboss who had somehow acquired it and used it as a trophy, unaware of its significance. The Salamanders' strike force that recovered it suffered significant casualties fighting through the Orc horde, but they considered any price acceptable for reclaiming one of their Primarch's works. The Gauntlet of the Forge exists as a single oversized gauntlet designed to fit a Primarch's hand, though Space Marines can wear it with difficulty and reduced functionality. The gauntlet's construction incorporates layered plates of an unknown alloy that shifts between metallic colors depending on the angle of observation. Power field generators built into the gauntlet's structure allow it to project a containment field capable of holding materials at temperatures that would normally vaporize most substances. This makes the gauntlet useful not just as a weapon, but as a tool for working with exotic materials or handling objects too dangerous for normal contact. The gauntlet can crush ceramite armor with ease when used as a weapon, and the power field can be extended outward to create a short-range energy blast. Vulkan wore this gauntlet frequently when working in his forge, and many Salamanders' artificers view it as the most sacred of the artifacts, because it represents their Primarch's identity as a craftsman rather than just a warrior. The chapter recovered the Gauntlet of the Forge from a Chaos Warband in the 39th millennium, after the Warband's sorcerer had attempted to use it in dark rituals. The gauntlet had resisted corruption, its nature as Vulkan's creation apparently providing protection against chaos influence. The Salamanders who recovered it reported that the gauntlet seemed to respond to their presence, its power fields activating spontaneously as they approached. Kasser's mantle takes the form of a cloak woven from materials that combine metallic threads with what appears to be Drake's scale, though analysis suggests the scales come from no creature currently living on Nocturne. The cloak provides exceptional protection against energy weapons, with its surface capable of dispersing Law's fire and plasma bolts across its area rather than allowing the energy to concentrate at impact points. The mantle also offers resistance to extreme temperatures, allowing the wearer to operate in environments that would normally require specialized equipment. Vulkan created this cloak and named it after one of his earliest companions on Nocturne, a warrior who died protecting civilians during a volcanic eruption. The name serves as a reminder that protection and sacrifice remain central to the Salamander's purpose. The cloak's recovery occurred during the 40th millennium on a shrine world, where it had been kept as a holy relic by the local population. who had no knowledge of its origins beyond legends that it had belonged to a great hero. The Salamanders negotiated with the shrine's keepers for its return, eventually convincing them that returning the cloak to Vulkan's sons served the emperors more effectively than keeping it as a static display. The Engine of Woes stands apart from the other artifacts in both form and function. Rather than a weapon or piece of equipment, it exists as a complex mechanism whose exact purpose remains unclear even to the Salamanders who have studied it. The device consists of interlocking components that move in patterns, suggesting some form of calculation or information processing, though it operates without any obvious power source and produces no detectable output. The name Engine of Woes comes from inscriptions on the device's casing, written in a language that combines elements of Nocturnian dialect with technical notation that even Mechanicus adepts struggle to fully translate. Some within the chapter believe the engine serves as a key or control mechanism for other artifacts, while others suggest it might be a recording device that contains information Vulkan wanted preserved. The Engine of Woes was recovered from a space hulk that drifted into Nocturne's system during the 41st millennium. A Salamander's boarding party found it in a section of the hulk that showed signs of having been deliberately sealed, as if someone had hidden the engine away for safekeeping before whatever catastrophe had created the hulk. The unbound flame exists as a torch that burns with fire that never consumes its fuel source and never diminishes in intensity. The flames shift through colors that range from deep red to blue-white, and they produce heat that can melt through bulkheads or cauterize wounds with equal effectiveness. Vulkan created the unbound flame as both a practical tool and a symbol of the Promethean cult's central metaphor. The flame that never dies represents the endurance of the human spirit and the eternal nature of the duty to protect. The torch has been lost and recovered multiple times throughout the chapter's history, with its current location unknown. The Salamanders believe it exists somewhere in the eastern fringe, based on fragmentary reports and divination performed by the chapter's librarians. Several expeditions have been launched to search for it, but none have yet succeeded in locating the artifact. The obsidian chariot represents one of the most unusual artifacts in terms of its scale and nature. Rather than a personal weapon or piece of equipment, the chariot is a vehicle that Vulkan constructed during the Great Crusade for purposes that remain unclear. The few descriptions that exist describe it as a land raider-sized vehicle with armor plating made from volcanic glass that has been somehow strengthened to exceed the durability of standard ceramite. The chariot's propulsion system operates silently, and it can traverse terrain that would immobilize conventional vehicles. Some accounts suggest the chariot can phase partially out of normal space, allowing it to pass through obstacles, though whether this represents actual capability or exaggeration in the retelling is uncertain. The obsidian chariot's location has been unknown since before the heresy, with some Salamanders scholars suggesting Vulkan deliberately hid it somewhere on Nocturne itself, while others believe he took it with him during his travels after the heresy, and it now rests on some distant world waiting to be found. Forge Hammer Thunderhead serves as both weapon and tool, embodying the dual nature of the Salamander's philosophy. The hammer's head measures nearly a meter across, with one face designed for forging and the other for combat. The weapon incorporates power field generators that can be activated to enhance its striking force, allowing it to shatter fortress walls or shape materials with equal effectiveness. Vulkan used Thunderhead extensively during the Great Crusade, both in his personal forge and on the battlefield. The hammer became associated with several significant victories, including the breaking of a Xenos fortress that had resisted Imperial assault for months. Thunderhead was lost during the Horus Heresy, last seen in Vulkan's possession before his capture by the Night Lords. The Salamanders believe Conrad Kurz took the hammer as a trophy, and it may have remained aboard the Nightfall or been distributed to the Night Lord's Legion after Kurz's death. Recovering Thunderhead represents one of the chapter's highest priorities, but tracking artifacts associated with a traitor legion presents obvious complications. 2 additional artifacts complete the 9, though their names and nature remain known only to the chapter's highest-ranking members. The Salamanders maintain strict secrecy about these final relics, with information about them restricted to the chapter master, the Forgefather, and perhaps a handful of senior officers. This secrecy serves multiple purposes. It protects the artifacts from those who might seek them for wrong reasons, and it ensures that if enemies capture and interrogate Salamanders, they cannot reveal information they do not possess. The secrecy also maintains an element of mystery around the quest, reminding the chapter that some knowledge must be earned rather than freely given. The role of Forgefather exists specifically to pursue the quest for Vulkan's artifacts. This position rotates among the chapter's most accomplished warriors and artificers, with each Forgefather serving until he either recovers an artifact, determines that current leads have been exhausted, or falls in battle. The Forgefather operates with considerable autonomy, able to requisition chapter resources and travel wherever the quest leads, without requiring approval from the chapter master for each decision. This independence is necessary because the search for artifacts often requires following fragmentary clues across vast distances and pursuing leads that might take years or decades to develop. The current Forgefather, like his predecessors, maintains a network of informants and contacts throughout the Imperium. These include rogue traders who operate in regions where the Salamanders rarely venture, Mechanicus adepts who might recognize Vulkan's work if they encounter it, and even some individuals of questionable loyalty who trade in artifacts and relics. The Forgefather must balance the need for information against the risks of revealing too much about what he seeks. Enemies who learn of the artifact's significance might attempt to claim them first, either to deny them to the Salamanders or to use them for their own purposes. Each recovered artifact undergoes extensive study before being sealed in the vault of Prometheus. The Salamander's artificers examine every aspect of the relic's construction, attempting to understand the techniques Vulkan employed and the principles underlying the artifact's capabilities. This study serves multiple purposes beyond simple curiosity. Understanding how Vulkan created these items helps the chapter's artificers improve their own work, maintaining the tradition of craftsmanship that their Primarch valued. The study also searches for clues about the other artifacts, as Vulkan sometimes incorporated references or connections between his works that might provide leads on where to search next. The quest for the artifacts has shaped Salamander's culture in ways that extend beyond the simple goal of recovering the relics. The search provides focus and purpose that helps the chapter maintain its identity across millennia. While other chapters might struggle with questions about their purpose in an Imperium that has changed dramatically since their founding, the Salamanders have a clear mission that connects them directly to their Primarch. The quest also reinforces the chapter's values of patience and perseverance. Recovering the artifacts cannot be rushed, and attempts to take shortcuts or use questionable methods would betray the principles Vulkan embodied. The Salamanders interpret the prophecy about Vulkan's return in various ways, with different factions within the chapter emphasizing different aspects. Some believe the return will be literal and physical, that Vulkan will walk out of the vault of Prometheus when the last artifact is placed within it. Others interpret the prophecy more metaphorically, suggesting that recovering all the artifacts will provide knowledge or capabilities that allow the chapter to embody Vulkan's legacy so completely that his return becomes spiritual rather than physical. Still others believe the prophecy describes conditions rather than mechanisms, that Vulkan will return when the Imperium's need is greatest, and the artifacts serve as signs that will indicate when that moment has arrived. The title of Forgefather carries weight that extends far beyond its function as a position within the Salamander's chapter structure. When a warrior accepts this role, he takes upon himself a burden that will consume the remainder of his service to the chapter and possibly his life. The Forgefather abandons his place within the company structure, surrenders his command responsibilities if he held any, and departs Nocturne to wander the Imperium in search of artifacts that might be anywhere across a million worlds or lost in the void between stars. This is not a temporary assignment that ends after a set period. The Forgefather serves until he recovers an artifact, until he exhausts all current leads, and must return to wait for new information to emerge, or until death claims him in some distant corner of the galaxy far from his chapter and homeworld. The selection process for the Forgifather position follows traditions established in the centuries after Vulkan's final departure. When the current Forgifather either completes his quest or falls in battle, the chapter master consults with the regent of Prometheus and the masters of the chapter's forge. Together, they review the service records of candidates who meet the basic requirements. The warrior must have served as first captain, leading the Fire Drakes and demonstrating both martial excellence and understanding of the Promethean cult's deeper principles. He must be an accomplished artificer, capable of recognizing Vulkan's work and understanding the techniques that went into creating the artifacts. Most importantly, he must possess the temperament to endure years or decades of searching with only fragmentary clues and rare successes to sustain him. The candidates who meet these criteria undergo a series of trials that test their suitability for the role. These trials examine not just combat capability or technical knowledge, but the psychological resilience required for the quest. One trial involves isolation in the deep volcanic chambers beneath Mount Deathfire, where the candidate must survive for a period known only to the chapter's leadership, while crafting an item of significance using only the tools and materials available in that hostile environment. The isolation tests whether the warrior can maintain focus and purpose when separated from his brothers, while the crafting requirement ensures he retains the skills that define Salamander's identity even under extreme stress. Another trial sends the candidate into Nocturne's ash wastes during the time of trial, when the planet's surface becomes a hell of volcanic eruptions and seismic activity. The warrior must locate and retrieve specific items scattered across the wastes before the trial period ends, navigating through conditions that challenge even space marine physiology. This trial tests the candidate's ability to pursue objectives in hostile environments without support, a skill essential for a Forgifather who might find himself searching through death worlds, demon-infested ruins, or the wreckage of space hulks. The final trial involves presenting the candidate with moral dilemmas that have no clear correct answers. The chapter's leadership constructs scenarios where recovering an artifact might require actions that conflict with Salamander's principles, where protecting civilians might mean allowing a lead on an artifact to go cold, or where the fastest path to success involves methods that Vulkan would have rejected. The candidate must articulate how he would handle these situations, demonstrating that he understands the balance between the quest's importance and the values that make the Salamanders worthy of their Primarch's legacy. A candidate who shows willingness to abandon principles for the sake of recovering artifacts faster disqualifies himself, regardless of his other capabilities. Once selected, the new Forgifather undergoes a ceremony in the sanctuary of the Primarch, where he swears oaths before the chapter master, and in the presence of whatever artifacts currently rest in the vault of Prometheus. He vows to seek the remaining artifacts with all his ability, to never rest while leads remain unpursued, and to uphold the Salamander's honor in all his actions, regardless of how far from Nocturne his quest takes him. The ceremony concludes with the Forgifather receiving the Spear of Vulkan if it has been recovered, or another relic weapon if the spear remains lost. He also receives access to chapter resources including a strike cruiser, a small force of Salamanders who volunteer to accompany him, and the accumulated knowledge from all previous Forgifathers about where they searched and what they learned. The Forgifather typically departs Nocturne with a hand-picked team of between 5 and 10 Salamanders. These warriors volunteer knowing they are leaving the chapter's main body for an indefinite period, that they might spend decades away from Nocturne, and that they face dangers ranging from Xenos threats to chaos corruption to simple accidents in the vast darkness between stars. The Forgifather selects his companions based on complementary skills. He needs warriors capable of fighting through any opposition they encounter, but also specialists who can interface with Mechanicus installations, navigate the Administratum's bureaucracy, or recognize the signs of Vulkan's work in unexpected places. The quest itself follows patterns established over 10 millennia of searching. The Forge-a-Father begins by reviewing all existing information about the artifacts, studying the records left by his predecessors, and analyzing any new intelligence that has emerged since the previous Forge-a-Father's departure. Some leads come from Salamanders who encounter references to unusual artifacts during their regular deployments. Others emerge from the Forge-a-Father's network of contacts throughout the Imperium. Rogue traders who operate in regions beyond normal Imperial authority sometimes bring back items or information about relics they encountered. Mechanicus adepts studying ancient battlefields occasionally find weapons or equipment that display characteristics consistent with Primarch-level craftsmanship. Inquisitors pursuing their own investigations might stumble across references to items matching descriptions of Vulkan's works. Each lead requires careful evaluation. The Imperium contains countless artifacts and relics, with many worlds holding items their populations believe possess special significance. Most of these items are either fraudulent, misidentified, or genuinely old, but not connected to Vulkan. The Forge-a-Father must distinguish between promising leads and dead ends without wasting years pursuing false trails. This requires deep knowledge of Vulkan's techniques and the characteristics that mark his work as distinct from even the finest creations of other artificers. The Forge-a-Father looks for specific details in the construction, particular alloys or working methods that Vulkan favored, and the presence of certain symbols or inscriptions that the Primarch incorporated into his works. When a lead appears credible, the Forge-a-Father and his team travel to investigate. These journeys can take them anywhere in the Imperium, and sometimes beyond its borders into regions where Imperial authority is nominal or non-existent. The Forge-a-Father might spend months traveling to a distant world in the Halo stars based on a rumor from a rogue trader, only to discover the artifact in question is a well-made but mundane weapon that local legend has elevated to mythical status. He might track an item through a series of owners across multiple sectors, piecing together its history from fragmentary records and interviews with those who possessed it or knew of it. Some investigations require infiltrating criminal organizations that traffic in stolen relics, while others involve negotiating with planetary governors or ecclesiarchy officials who view items in their possession as sacred objects not to be surrendered regardless of the Forge-a-Father's claims. The recovery of artifacts sometimes requires combat when their current possessors refuse to relinquish them peacefully, or when the artifacts have fallen into enemy hands. Orc warbosses occasionally acquire powerful weapons and use them without understanding their significance, as happened with the Spear of Vulkan. Chaos warbands sometimes claim artifacts specifically to deny them to the Imperium or to corrupt them for dark purposes, though Vulkan's works have consistently resisted chaos influence in ways that suggest the Primarch built protections into their fundamental structure. Recovering artifacts from such enemies requires the Forge-a-Father and his team to fight through whatever forces protect the relic, extract it from potentially hostile environments, and escape with it intact. The history of the Forge-a-Father position includes both triumphant successes and tragic failures. Kashan Dracos served as Forge-a-Father during the 38th millennium and achieved the recovery of the Spear of Vulkan after a campaign that lasted 3 decades. Dracos tracked the spear through a series of owners and conflicts, eventually locating it in the possession of an orc warboss who had claimed it as a trophy after killing an Imperial commander who had somehow acquired it. Dracos led his team in a boarding action against the Orc Space Hulk flagship, fighting through thousands of greenskins to reach the warboss's throne room. The battle against the warboss cost Dracos his left arm and the lives of 4 of his 6 companions, but he succeeded in recovering the spear and returning it to Nocturne. The chapter celebrated his success with ceremonies that lasted for weeks, and Dracos spent his remaining years training the next generation of artificers in techniques he had refined during his long quest. Ushorak bore the title of Forge-a-Father in the 39th millennium and recovered the Gauntlet of the Forge from a Chaos warband that had attempted to use it in sorcerous rituals. Ushorak spent 15 years tracking the Gauntlet through the Eye of Terror's periphery, following reports of a relic that resisted corruption despite being in Chaos hands for centuries. The final confrontation occurred on a demon world where reality itself was unstable, with the laws of physics bending in ways that made conventional tactics useless. Ushurak and his team fought through cultists and demons to reach the chamber where the Chaos Sorcerer kept the gauntlet, and in the battle that followed, Ushurak discovered that the gauntlet responded to his presence in ways it had not for its Chaos captors. The artifact's power fields activated spontaneously, allowing Ushurak to strike down the sorcerer and his summoned demons. The extraction from the demon world cost the lives of all but one of Ushurak's companions, and Ushurak himself bore wounds that never fully healed despite the enhanced regeneration of space marine physiology. Mirzan held the position of Forgefather during the 40th millennium and achieved the recovery of Kesser's mantle through negotiation rather than combat. Mirzan tracked the mantle to a shrine world where it had been kept as a holy relic for millennia, with the local population venerating it as the cloak of a great saint whose true identity had been lost to time. Rather than simply taking the mantle by force, which would have been within his authority as a space marine claiming a chapter relic, Mirzan spent years working with the shrine's keepers to convince them that returning the mantle to the Salamanders served the emperors more effectively than keeping it as a static display. He demonstrated his knowledge of the mantle's history and Vulkan's life, proving the connection between the relic and the Salamanders. He also helped the Shrine World's population during a crisis when Xeno's raiders attacked, leading the defense personally and ensuring minimal civilian casualties. This demonstration of Salamander's values, combined with his patient diplomacy, eventually convinced the Shrine Keepers to entrust the mantle to his care. Mirzan's success showed that the Forgefather's role required more than just martial prowess and tracking skills, that sometimes recovering artifacts demanded understanding of human nature and the ability to build trust with those who possessed items they valued deeply. Not all Forgefathers achieved their goals or survived their quests. Berk Thunderfist departed Nocturne in the 37th millennium following raids about the Obsidian Chariot, the vehicle-sized artifact whose location had been unknown since before the heresy. Berk and his team traveled to the Ghoul Stars region based on fragmentary reports from a rogue trader expedition that had encountered ruins containing technology-matching descriptions of Vulkan's work. The Forgefather's strike cruiser entered the Ghoul Stars and was never heard from again. Decades later, wreckage identified as belonging to Berk's vessel was discovered drifting in the void, its hull breached and its interior showing signs of catastrophic combat. No bodies were recovered, and no evidence of what had destroyed the ship or killed its crew could be determined. The Salamanders mourned Berk's loss and the failure of his quest, but they also honored his willingness to venture into one of the galaxy's most dangerous regions in pursuit of their Primarch's legacy. The costs paid by Forgefathers and their companions accumulate across the millennia into a toll measured in lives spent and years devoted to the quest. Every artifact recovered represents not just the physical object, but the sacrifice of those who died seeking it, the decades spent following false leads, and the separation from the chapter and Nocturne that defines the Forgefather's existence. The Salamanders view these costs as necessary and acceptable, part of the greater duty they owe to Vulkan and to the prophecy of his return. The willingness to pay such prices demonstrates the chapter's commitment to their Primarch's memory and their faith in his eventual return. As of the 42nd millennium, the majority of the 9 artifacts have been recovered and secured in the Vault of Prometheus. The Spear of Vulkan rests in its prepared chamber, maintained in the same condition it held when Kashan Dracos recovered it. The Gauntlet of the Forge occupies another chamber, its power fields dormant but ready to activate at the touch of one deemed worthy. Kesser's mantle hangs in its designated space, the Drake scales still gleaming despite millennia of existence. The Engine of Woes sits in its chamber, its components still moving in their mysterious patterns. Several other artifacts whose names remain restricted knowledge also rest in the vault, each representing the success of a Forgefather's quest and bringing the Salamanders closer to the prophecy's fulfillment. The current Forgefather continues the quest for the remaining artifacts, following leads that take him across the Imperium Nihilus and into regions where the Great Rift's emergence has made travel and communication difficult. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum has complicated the search in some ways, while potentially creating opportunities in others. Worlds that were stable and well documented before the Rift's appearance have fallen into chaos or been cut off from regular Imperial contact, making it harder to pursue established leads. However, the upheaval has also brought to light artifacts and relics that were previously hidden or forgotten, as populations fleeing disaster bring their treasures with them, or as battlefields expose ruins that had been buried for millennia. The Salamanders maintain their vigil and continue their quest with the same patience and determination that has characterized their search since Vulkan's departure. Each recovered artifact brings them closer to the moment when all nine will rest together in the Vault of Prometheus, when the conditions described in the prophecy will be fulfilled, and when their Primarch will return to lead them once more. Whether that return will be literal or metaphorical, physical or spiritual, remains to be seen. What matters to the Salamanders is that they continue the work their Primarch set for them, that they maintain the values he taught them, and that when Vulkan does return, he will find his sons worthy of the legacy he left them. The Imperium's vast bureaucracy processes billions of reports daily, most of them routine accounts of battles fought, worlds defended, and enemies destroyed. Occasionally, reports surface that defy easy categorization, accounts that describe events suggesting intervention by forces beyond normal Imperial capabilities. Among these unusual reports, a pattern has emerged over the millennia. Sightings of a massive warrior matching Vulkan's distinctive appearance, appearing during desperate battles to aid Imperial forces before vanishing without explanation. These accounts come from across the Imperium, from battlefields on worlds that have never seen a salamander, from sectors where the chapter has no recorded presence, and from situations where no reinforcements could have arrived through normal means. The reports share common elements despite originating from wildly different sources and locations. Witnesses describe a warrior of immense size, larger even than standard space marines, with obsidian black skin and eyes that glow with red fire. The figure wields weapons that match descriptions of Vulkan's personal armaments, particularly a massive hammer that crushes enemy armor with single blows. The warrior appears when Imperial forces face overwhelming odds, when defeat seems certain and survival unlikely. He fights with devastating effectiveness, turning the tide of battles through sheer martial prowess and tactical intervention. Then, once the immediate crisis passes, he disappears without identifying himself or explaining his presence. A particularly detailed account comes from the Agrippina sector in the 41st millennium, where an Imperial Guard regiment found itself surrounded by an Orc that had overrun their defensive positions. The regimental commander's report, preserved in the Adeptus Munitorum archives, describes how a lone warrior appeared from the smoke of burning Prometheum tanks. The figure stood head and shoulders above the guardsmen, his armor bearing iconography that the commander did not recognize, but later identified as similar to Salamander's heraldry when shown comparison images. The warrior carved through the Orc forces with a hammer that pulverized the greenskins' crude armor and their bodies beneath it. He directed the Guard regiment's retreat, pointing out paths through the Orc lines that allowed the humans to escape encirclement. When the regiment reached safety and the commander turned to thank their savior, the warrior had vanished. No Space Marine chapter claimed responsibility for the intervention, and the Salamanders chapter, when queried, stated they had no forces in that sector at the time. Another report originates from a hive world in the Segmentum Tempestus, where a genestealer cult uprising threatened to overwhelm the planetary defense forces. The Arbites precinct commander who filed the report described a massive figure who appeared in the Underhive Warrens, where the cult had established its primary nest. The warrior moved through the darkness with purpose, his burning eyes providing illumination that revealed the cult's hidden positions. He killed the cult's magus and patriarch in close combat, breaking the psychic coordination that had made the cultists so effective. The Arbites forces, emboldened by this intervention, pressed their attack and succeeded in purging the cult from the hive. The commander's report noted that the warrior bore scars that looked like they had been inflicted by blades, fire, and weapons the commander could not identify, suggesting a history of combat that spanned far longer than any normal warrior's career. The administratum's response to these reports follows predictable patterns. Lower-level officials typically dismiss them as exaggerations, the products of stress and combat fatigue that cause witnesses to misremember events or attribute natural occurrences to supernatural intervention. When pressed, these officials suggest that the witnesses probably saw a particularly large space marine or perhaps an Ogren auxiliary whose size and strength became exaggerated in retelling. The reports get filed in archives where they gather dust alongside millions of other documents that bureaucrats deem insufficiently important to warrant higher-level attention. However, some reports reach officials with enough knowledge of Space Marine chapters and Primarch history to recognize their potential significance. These individuals understand that a warrior matching Vulkan's description appearing across multiple sectors over extended time periods suggests something beyond simple misidentification. They forward the reports to the Inquisition or directly to the Salamanders chapter, recognizing that such accounts might represent genuine evidence of the Primarch's continued activity in the galaxy. The Inquisition maintains files on all reports that might indicate Primarch sightings, not just those potentially involving Vulkan. The Ordo Hereticus particularly interests itself in such accounts, given that several traitor Primarchs remain active in the galaxy, and any loyalist Primarch's return could significantly affect the balance of power between the Imperium and Chaos. Inquisitors assigned to investigate Vulkan sightings approach the task with appropriate skepticism, aware that most such reports will prove to be cases of mistaken identity, deliberate fraud, or genuine mysteries that nonetheless have mundane explanations. Inquisitor Helena Valeria spent 3 decades of her career investigating Vulkan sightings across the Segmentum Obscurus. Her sealed report, accessible only to those with Vermilion-level clearance, catalogs 47 separate incidents where witnesses claim to have seen a warrior matching the Primarch's description. Valeria personally investigated 12 of these incidents, interviewing witnesses, examining battlefields, and analyzing any physical evidence that remained. Her conclusions, while cautious, suggested that at least 3 of the incidents she investigated could not be easily explained as misidentification or fraud. The witnesses in these cases included experienced military officers whose service records indicated reliability and sound judgment. The tactical interventions described in their reports displayed sophistication consistent with Primarch-level strategic thinking. Most significantly, in one case, Valeria recovered a fragment of ceramite armor from the battlefield that bore markings consistent with Salamander's iconography, but manufactured using techniques that predated the Horus Heresy. The Salamanders chapter receives copies of all credible reports involving potential Vulkan sightings. The chapter's librarians maintain a dedicated archive for these accounts, cross-referencing them with historical records and searching for patterns that might indicate where their Primarch travels or what purposes guide his movements. The librarians approach this task with the same methodical patience that characterizes all Salamanders' endeavors, understanding that hasty conclusions serve no purpose and that the truth will reveal itself through careful analysis over time. Chief Librarian Velkona compiled a comprehensive analysis of all Vulkan sighting reports received by the chapter between the 38th and 41st millennia. His work, preserved in the Librarius Sanctorum on Nocturne, identified several patterns in the reports. Sightings cluster around certain types of events: battles where civilian populations face imminent slaughter, situations where Imperial forces fight against overwhelming odds to protect non-combatants, and confrontations with enemies that employ particularly cruel or terror-based tactics. This pattern aligns with Vulkan's known character and the values he instilled in his legion. If the Primarch continues to operate in the galaxy, he apparently does so in ways consistent with his fundamental nature as protector and defender. Velkona's analysis also noted geographical patterns in the sighting reports. Certain sectors and subsectors show higher concentrations of reports than others, suggesting that Vulkan, if these sightings are genuine, focuses his activities in specific regions. Some of these regions align with locations where the Salamanders recovered artifacts, leading to speculation that Vulkan might be guiding his sons toward the remaining relics through indirect means. Other high-concentration regions have no obvious connection to the artifacts, but face particular threats from Xeno's invasions or Chaos incursions, suggesting the Primarch prioritizes areas where his intervention can have maximum impact on protecting human populations. Beyond reports from non-Salamander sources, the chapter's own warriors experience phenomena that they interpret as evidence of their Primarch's continued existence and his awareness of their struggles. These experiences typically occur during moments of extreme crisis, when individual Salamanders or entire squads face situations that push them to the limits of their capabilities. The phenomenon manifests as visions, sensations of presence, or inexplicable events that the Salamanders attribute to Vulkan's influence. Brother Sergeant Pretor of the 3rd Company reported an experience during a boarding action against a Chaos vessel in the 41st millennium. His squad had penetrated deep into the ship's interior when they encountered a greater demon that had been summoned by the vessel's sorcerer captain. The demon killed 3 of Pretor's squad in the opening moments of combat, and the survivors found themselves outmatched by an enemy whose power exceeded anything they had trained to face. Pretor reported that in the moment when death seemed certain, he experienced a vision of Vulkan standing beside him, the Primarch's presence filling him with renewed strength and clarity of purpose. The vision lasted only seconds, but when it faded, Pretor found himself fighting with enhanced effectiveness, his movements guided by tactical insights that seemed to come from outside his own consciousness. His squad succeeded in banishing the demon and completing their mission, though Pretor could never adequately explain how they had survived an encounter that should have killed them all. Similar accounts appear throughout the chapter's records, spanning millennia and involving Salamanders from all companies and specializations. A tech marine working to repair a damaged land raider under fire reported feeling hands guiding his own as he performed emergency repairs that saved his squad from destruction. A chaplain leading his company in a desperate defense against a Tyrannid swarm described hearing Vulkan's voice reciting passages from the Tome of Fire, the words providing tactical insights that allowed the Salamanders to identify weaknesses in the Tyrannid attack pattern. An apothecary treating critically wounded battle brothers in a field hospital reported seeing a figure matching Vulkan's description moving among the injured, though none of the patients or other medical personnel saw anything unusual. The chapter's librarians pay particular attention to visions experienced during meditation in the forged temples scattered across Nocturne. These sacred spaces, where Salamanders practice their craft and contemplate the Promethean cult's teachings, seem to facilitate experiences that the librarians classify as psychic phenomena rather than simple hallucinations or stress responses. Salamanders who meditate in the forged temples while handling artifacts recovered from Vulkan's scattered works report the highest frequency of visions, suggesting a connection between the Primarch's creations and his continued psychic presence. Brother Epistolaria Shaman conducted a study of forged temple visions over a 50-year period, interviewing Salamanders who reported such experiences and attempting to identify common elements. His research, while incomplete due to the subjective nature of the phenomena, suggested that the visions often contain information that the experiencing Salamander could not have known through normal means. Several subjects reported visions that included details about battles occurring in distant sectors, information that was later confirmed when astropathic communications reached Nocturne. Others described seeing locations they had never visited, places that investigation revealed to be real worlds where Vulkan had fought during the Great Crusade, or where his artifacts might be hidden. The librarians debate extensively about how to interpret these phenomena. Some argue that the visions represent genuine psychic contact with Vulkan, that the Primarch's perpetual nature allows his consciousness to persist in ways that transcend normal physical limitations. This interpretation suggests Vulkan exists in a state between life and death, his awareness distributed across the galaxy in ways that allow him to observe his sons and occasionally communicate with them through psychic means. Other librarians propose that the visions emerge from the collective unconscious of the Salamanders chapter, that millennia of shared culture and devotion to their Primarch have created a psychic gestalt that manifests as visions of Vulkan during moments of extreme stress or deep meditation. A third interpretation, favored by the more pragmatic members of the Librarius, suggests that the visions might be products of the artifacts themselves. Vulkan crafted his works with techniques that incorporated principles beyond simple material engineering, possibly including psychic elements that allow the artifacts to store impressions or information. When salamanders handle these artifacts or meditate in their presence, they might access these stored impressions, experiencing them as visions of their Primarch. This theory would explain why forged temple visions occur most frequently when the experiencing salamander handles recovered artifacts, and it would not require accepting that Vulkan maintains active psychic contact with his chapter from wherever he currently resides. The chapter's leadership treats all reports of visions and unusual experiences with appropriate caution, aware that chaos corruption can manifest as false visions designed to mislead or corrupt. Every salamander who reports experiencing a vision undergoes examination by the Librarius to ensure no taint of chaos has influenced their experience. The chaplains also interview these warriors, assessing whether their visions align with the Promethean cult's teachings or contain elements that contradict salamanders' values. This screening process filters out most reports as either genuine stress responses, minor psychic phenomena with no broader significance, or in rare cases, evidence of chaos influence that requires immediate intervention. The reports that survive this screening process get added to the archive of credible phenomena, joining accounts that span back to shortly after Vulkan's disappearance through the Webway Gate. The accumulated evidence, while not constituting proof in any scientific or absolute sense, creates a pattern that the salamanders interpret as confirming their Primarch's continued existence. Vulkan remains active in the galaxy, whether in physical form appearing at battlefields where his intervention can save lives, or in psychic form maintaining awareness of his sons and occasionally guiding them through visions and impressions. The exact nature of his existence matters less to the salamanders than the conviction that their father has not abandoned them, that he watches over them still, and that when the time comes for his prophesied return, he will find them worthy of the legacy he left them. The discovery of artifacts and craftsmanship bearing Vulkan's distinctive style in unexpected locations provides more tangible evidence of the Primarch's possible continued activity. These finds differ from the 9 major artifacts that form the focus of the Forgefather's quest. They consist of smaller items, works that display techniques and characteristics consistent with Vulkan's craftsmanship, but were not among the relics he specifically designated for recovery. The existence of these items in locations where Vulkan has no recorded presence during the Great Crusade or Heresy suggests he may have created them more recently, during his long absence from the Imperium. A Mechanicus explorator fleet discovered one such item on a world in the eastern fringe that had been abandoned during Old Night and never brought into Imperial compliance. The explorators found ruins that predated human settlement of the region, and among the Xenos artifacts they recovered was a human-made hammer that analysis dated to some time after the Horus Heresy. The hammer's construction incorporated techniques that matched Vulkan's known methods, including alloy compositions and forging patterns that appeared in his documented works. The hammer showed signs of use in combat, with impact damage consistent with fighting against heavily armored opponents. The Mechanicus reported the find to the Salamanders, who sent a delegation to examine it. The chapter's master of the forge confirmed that the hammer bore all the hallmarks of Vulkan's work, though it was not one of the 9 artifacts. The hammer's presence on a world Vulkan had never visited according to any Imperial records suggested the Primarch had traveled there at some point during his long absence, though why he went there and what he did remained mysteries. Similar discoveries occur with enough frequency to suggest a pattern rather than isolated incidents. A rogue trader expedition recovered a set of armor plates from a derelict vessel drifting in the void between stars, plates that displayed craftsmanship consistent with Vulkan's techniques and bore Salamander's iconography from the Heresy era. An inquisitor investigating a cult on a civilized world discovered that the cult's leadership possessed a blade that forensic analysis indicated had been forged within the last millennium, using methods that matched Vulkan's documented approach to weapon making. An Adeptus Arbites raid on a criminal organization's headquarters on a hive world turned up a gauntlet that the Salamanders later confirmed as genuine Vulkan work, though not the gauntlet of the forge that rests in the vault of Prometheus. These discoveries raise questions that the Salamanders and Imperial authorities cannot definitively answer. If Vulkan continues to create items using his distinctive techniques, it suggests he maintains access to forges and materials suitable for such work. This implies he either has established bases in unknown locations where he can work undisturbed, or he has access to facilities within the webway that allow him to continue his craft. The distribution of these items across widely separated regions of the galaxy suggests extensive travel, which would be consistent with reports of battlefield appearances in different sectors. The items themselves provide no direct information about Vulkan's purposes or plans, but their existence confirms that the Primarch remains capable of functioning as both warrior and artificer, the dual nature that always defined his character. The galaxy split open in the closing years of the 41st millennium, when the forces of chaos achieved a victory whose scope exceeded even the darkest predictions of the Imperium's seers and strategists. The ritual on Cadia, that fortress world which had stood against the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, succeeded despite the desperate efforts of Imperial defenders. Abaddon the Despoiler threw the broken pieces of the ancient pylons into the warp, and the barrier that had contained the Eye of Terror collapsed. Reality itself tore across the galaxy, creating a wound that would become known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that now divides the Imperium into two distinct regions with vastly different conditions and challenges. The Great Rift stretches across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror in the galactic northwest to the Hadex anomaly in the southeast, a massive tear in reality through which the warp bleeds into real space continuously. The Rift's presence fundamentally altered the nature of travel and communication across the Imperium. Worlds on the far side of the Rift, in the region that came to be called Imperium Nihilus, or the Dark Imperium, found themselves cut off from Terra and the Astronomican's light. The psychic beacon that had guided navigators for 10 millennia became dim or invisible from these regions, making warp travel exponentially more dangerous. Astropathic communication, already unreliable across the Imperium's vast distances, became nearly impossible across the Rift. Worlds in the Imperium Nihilus faced their enemies alone, unable to call for reinforcements or even confirm whether the rest of the Imperium still existed. The Rift's opening coincided with massive chaos invasions across both sides of the divide. Demon incursions that would normally have required specific conditions and rituals became commonplace as the barrier between real space and the warp weakened. Worlds that had never faced demonic threats suddenly found themselves fighting entities that conventional weapons could barely harm. Chaos Space Marine warbands emerged from the Eye of Terror, and other warp rifts in numbers not seen since the Horus Heresy, their forces bolstered by demons and cultists who flocked to their banners. The Death Guard launched a massive invasion into Ultramar, bringing Nurgle's plagues to worlds that had been bastions of Imperial strength. The Thousand Suns attacked worlds across multiple sectors, seeking artifacts and knowledge while their sorcery twisted reality around them. The Imperium's response to these catastrophic events came from an unexpected source. Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, returned to active command after 10,000 years of stasis in his shrine on Muck Crag. The circumstances of his resurrection involved the intervention of the Eldar, specifically Ivrain of the Inari, whose powers derived from their god of death allowed her to heal the wound that had kept Guilliman in stasis since the heresy. The Primarch awoke to an Imperium that bore little resemblance to the realm he had helped build after the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne. The bureaucracy had calcified into a system that valued procedure over results. The ecclesiarchy preached worship of the Emperor as a god, a concept that would have been considered heresy during the Great Crusade. The Space Marine chapters operated according to traditions that had accumulated over millennia, some of which contradicted the practical doctrines Guilliman had established in his Codex Astartes. Guilliman's journey to Terra and his meeting with the Emperor, such as it was with his father reduced to a barely conscious psychic presence bound to the Golden Throne, galvanized the Primarch into action. He assumed the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium, a position that gave him authority over the Imperium's military forces and significant influence over its political apparatus. The Primarch immediately began organizing what would become the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military campaign designed to stabilize the Imperium's borders, reinforce worlds cut off by the Great Rift, and push back the chaos invasions that threatened to overwhelm humanity's defenses. The Indomitus Crusade represented the largest military mobilization the Imperium had undertaken since the Great Crusade itself. Guilliman gathered fleets from across the Imperium Sanctus, the region on Terra's side of the Great Rift where the Astronomicon still functioned reliably. He deployed the Primaris Space Marines, a new generation of enhanced warriors that Archmagos Belisarius Cawl had developed over 10 millennia using genetic templates and techniques that Guilliman had provided before his wounding. These Primaris Marines stood taller and stronger than their standard battle brothers, equipped with new patterns of armor and weapons that incorporated technological advances from Cawl's long research. Their deployment to both existing chapters and newly founded ones provided a significant boost to the Imperium's military capabilities at a moment when such reinforcement was desperately needed. The Crusades' fleets pushed out from Terra in multiple directions, fighting to re-establish contact with isolated regions and destroy enemy forces that had established themselves on Imperial worlds. Guilliman personally led some of these campaigns, his presence on the battlefield inspiring Imperial forces, and his strategic genius allowing for victories that other commanders might not have achieved. The Crusades succeeded in stabilizing large sections of the Imperium Sanctus and even managed to establish the Nachmund Gauntlet, a relatively stable corridor through the Great Rift that allowed limited travel and communication between the Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus. However, the scale of the threats facing the Imperium exceeded even what the Indomitus Crusade could fully address. The Great Rift continued to spawn demon incursions across thousands of worlds. Chaos forces controlled entire sectors that had fallen during the initial invasions. Xeno's threats that had been contained before the Rift's opening now expanded aggressively, taking advantage of the Imperium's distraction and weakened defensive positions. The Tyranids continued their advance into the galaxy, with multiple hive fleets approaching from different vectors. The Orcs launched wars across dozens of sectors, their naturally aggressive tendencies amplified by the galaxy-wide chaos. The Necrons awakened on tomb worlds throughout the Imperium, pursuing their own inscrutable agendas that often brought them into conflict with Imperial forces. Guilliman's return demonstrated that the Primarchs could come back, that the Emperor's sons were not permanently lost to death or disappearance. This realization spread throughout the Imperium's military forces and civilian populations, creating hope that other Primarchs might return to lead humanity in its darkest hour. The Space Marine chapters whose Primarch's fates remained ambiguous began searching for signs of their gene fathers with renewed intensity. The Salamanders, who had always maintained their vigil in their quest for Vulkan's artifacts, found their convictions strengthened by Guilliman's example. If one Primarch could return after 10,000 years, then their prophecies about Vulkan's return gained credibility beyond the chapter's internal faith. The threats that the Imperium faces in the era Indomitus align precisely with the areas where Vulkan's unique capabilities and philosophy would provide maximum benefit. The demon incursions that plague worlds across both sides of the Great Rift require responses that combine martial prowess with understanding of how to fight enemies that operate according to rules different from normal warfare. Demons cannot be permanently killed in real space through conventional means. They must be banished back to the warp, which requires either overwhelming violence that destroys their physical manifestations, or the use of specific weapons and techniques that disrupt their connection to real space. Vulkan's artifacts, many of which were designed during an era when the Imperium fought demons regularly during the Heresy, incorporate properties that make them particularly effective against warp entities. The Spear of Vulkan, for instance, possesses the ability to permanently harm demons in ways that standard weapons cannot. The spear's construction incorporated materials and techniques that Vulkan developed specifically for fighting chaos forces, knowledge he gained during the Heresy when the full nature of the chaos threat became apparent to the loyalist Primarchs. A warrior wielding the spear can banish greater demons with strikes that would only temporarily inconvenience them if delivered by normal weapons. Vulkan himself, with his millennia of experience fighting chaos forces and his intimate knowledge of how his artifacts function, would be exponentially more effective against demon incursions than even the most skilled Space Marine commanders currently leading Imperial forces. The protection of civilian populations during warfare has become more critical and more difficult in the era Indomitus than at any point since the Horus Heresy. The scale of the conflicts and the nature of many enemies mean that civilian casualties occur at catastrophic rates. Chaos invasions deliberately target civilian populations, seeking to harvest souls for dark gods or corrupt survivors into cultists. Tyrannid invasions consume entire populations, leaving worlds as lifeless rocks stripped of all organic matter. Orc-Waz rampage through civilian areas, killing for the simple joy of violence. The Imperium's military forces, stretched thin across thousands of active war zones, often lack the resources to adequately protect civilian populations while simultaneously fighting enemy forces. Vulkan's philosophy, as encoded in the Promethean cult and demonstrated throughout his career, placed civilian protection as a primary rather than secondary concern. He taught his sons that the purpose of warfare was not conquest or destruction, but the preservation of human civilization. The Salamanders continue to follow these teachings, accepting higher casualties among their own forces rather than employing tactics that would endanger civilians. However, the Salamanders chapter numbers only approximately 1,000 warriors, and they cannot be everywhere they are needed simultaneously. Vulkan's return would provide not just another powerful combatant, but a leader whose strategic thinking naturally incorporates civilian protection into military planning at the highest levels. The Primarch's approach to warfare would influence how the Imperium conducts operations across entire sectors. His presence in command positions would ensure that civilian casualties received consideration in strategic planning rather than being dismissed as acceptable collateral damage. His example would reinforce the principles that the Salamanders have maintained for 10 millennia, demonstrating to other chapters and Imperial military forces that protecting civilians does not represent weakness, but rather the fulfillment of their fundamental purpose. In an era when the Imperium's survival depends on maintaining the loyalty and productivity of its vast civilian population, Vulkan's philosophy offers practical advantages beyond moral considerations. The psychological impact of Vulkan's return would rival its tactical and strategic benefits. The Imperium in the era Indomitus faces a crisis of morale that threatens to undermine its military effectiveness. Populations on worlds throughout the Imperium nihilists believe themselves abandoned by Terra, cut off from the Emperor's light, and left to face extinction alone. Even in the Imperium Sanctus, where the Astronomicon still functions, the scale of the threats and the constant stream of bad news from across the galaxy creates despair that chaos actively cultivates and exploits. The Ecclesiarchy preaches faith and duty, but empty words from priests who have never faced battle provide limited comfort to populations watching their worlds burn. Guilliman's return provided hope, demonstrating that the Imperium's greatest heroes had not abandoned humanity. However, Guilliman's nature as an administrator and strategist, while crucial for organizing the Imperium's response to its crises, does not inspire the same emotional connection as a Primarch whose legend emphasizes compassion and protection. Guilliman is respected and obeyed, but he is not loved in the way that Vulkan was and is by those who know his story. The Primarch of the Ultramarines represents order and efficiency, qualities the Imperium desperately needs, but which do not address the deeper psychological wounds that millennia of grinding warfare have inflicted on its populations. Vulkan represents something different. His legend emphasizes not just his combat prowess, but his compassion, his willingness to sacrifice himself for others, and his fundamental humanity despite his superhuman nature. Stories of Vulkan personally leading rescue efforts to save civilians, of him working in his forge to create tools that improved people's lives rather than just weapons of war, of him maintaining connections to his adoptive family on Nocturne throughout his life, all paint a picture of a Primarch who genuinely cared about individual human lives rather than viewing humanity as an abstract concept to be protected. His return would provide hope of a different character than Guilliman's return offered, hope that the Imperium's leadership includes individuals who remember that the countless billions of humans they defend are not just resources or statistics, but people worthy of protection for their own sake. The Salamanders chapter has intensified their efforts to recover the remaining artifacts, driven by conviction that the conditions described in their prophecies have been met. The Imperium faces its darkest hour, a statement that might have seemed like hyperbole at various points in Imperial history, but which now appears simply factual. The galaxy has literally split in half, demons walk openly on thousands of worlds, and entire sectors have fallen to enemies that the Imperium lacks the resources to effectively fight. If these conditions do not constitute the darkest hour that the prophecies referenced, then it is difficult to imagine what circumstances would qualify. The current Forgefather operates with unprecedented urgency, following leads that previous holders of the position might have dismissed as too uncertain or dangerous to pursue. The opening of the Great Rift has created opportunities as well as challenges for the artifact quest. Worlds that were previously stable and well documented have fallen into chaos, their populations fleeing with whatever treasures they could carry. These refugee movements have brought artifacts into circulation that might have remained hidden for millennia under more stable conditions. Space hulks that drift through the rift sometimes contain sections of vessels from the Heresy era, potentially holding artifacts that were lost when those ships were destroyed or abandoned 10,000 years ago. The Salamanders have deployed more resources to support the Forgefather's quest than at any previous point in their history. Multiple strike forces operate across both sides of the Great Rift, investigating reports of artifacts and fighting to recover them from whoever currently possesses them. The chapter's librarians focus their divination efforts on locating the remaining relics, accepting the risks that such psychic activity entails in an era when the warp presses closer to real space than ever before. The chapter master has declared that recovering the final artifacts takes precedence over almost all other concerns, a decision that reflects both the prophecy's importance and the practical recognition that Vulkan's return would provide capabilities the chapter desperately needs. The nature of the enemies the Imperium faces makes Vulkan's specific skills and experience particularly valuable. The demon incursions require leaders who understand how chaos operates, who fought against it during the Heresy when the threat first fully manifested. Vulkan's experience being tortured by Conrad Kurz, while traumatic, gave him intimate knowledge of how chaos corrupts and how its servants think. His perpetual nature means he has potentially been fighting chaos forces for 10,000 years, accumulating combat experience against demons and traitor space marines that no currently active Imperial commander can match. His artifacts were designed specifically to fight such enemies, incorporating principles and techniques that have been largely lost to the modern Imperium. The protection of civilian populations requires not just tactical skill, but the moral authority to enforce policies that other commanders might view as inefficient or wasteful. Vulkan's status as a Primarch gives him authority that transcends normal command structures, allowing him to override decisions by other Imperial leaders when those decisions would result in unnecessary civilian casualties. His reputation and the loyalty he inspires mean that forces under his command would follow orders to protect civilians even when doing so increases their own risk, because they would trust that their Primarch's strategic vision accounts for factors beyond immediate tactical advantage. The need for hope and compassion in the era Indomitus cannot be overstated. The Imperium has always been a grim place where individual lives matter little compared to the species' survival, but the current crisis has pushed this tendency to extremes that threaten to become counterproductive. Populations that believe they have no future beyond endless suffering become vulnerable to chaos corruption, or simply lose the will to resist when enemies attack. The Imperium needs leaders who can inspire genuine hope rather than just demanding obedience, who can demonstrate through their actions that individual human lives have value beyond their utility to the Imperial war machine. Vulkan represents this type of leadership in ways that few other figures in Imperial history have matched. The Salamanders maintain their vigil, continue their quest, and prepare for the day when all 9 artifacts rest together in the vault of Prometheus. They believe that day approaches, that the galaxy's current state fulfills the conditions their Primarch described before his departure. Whether Vulkan's return will be literal or metaphorical, physical or spiritual, remains to be seen. What the Salamanders know with certainty is that the Imperium needs their Primarch now more than at any point since he walked through the Webway Gate and disappeared from Imperial history. The darkest hour has arrived, and with it, the hope that Vulkan will return to lead his sons and defend humanity once more against the enemies that threaten to extinguish the Imperium's light forever. The question of how Vulkan might return to the Imperium has occupied Salamander's scholars, Imperial historians, and those few outside the chapter who know of the prophecies for millennia. The fragmentary nature of the information Vulkan left before his departure through the Webway Gate allows for multiple interpretations, each supported by different pieces of evidence, and each carrying different implications for what conditions must be met before the Primarch's return becomes possible. These theories range from literal interpretations of the prophecy, requiring specific physical actions, to more abstract understandings that emphasize spiritual or symbolic fulfillment of conditions Vulkan established. The completion theory represents the most straightforward interpretation of the prophecy, and the one that drives the Salamander's ongoing quest for the artifacts. This theory holds that Vulkan will return, physically and literally, when all 9 artifacts he created and scattered are recovered and placed together in the vault of Prometheus on Nocturne. The prophecy, as recorded in the most ancient Salamander's texts, states that the artifacts serve as keys to the Primarch's return. Proponents of the completion theory interpret this statement literally rather than metaphorically. The artifacts are not symbolic representations of worthiness or spiritual development. They are actual mechanisms or components of a system that Vulkan designed to facilitate his return when specific conditions were met. This interpretation gains support from what is known about Vulkan's skills as an artificer and his understanding of technologies that bordered on the arcane. The Primarch created works that incorporated principles beyond simple material engineering, items whose capabilities sometimes seem to defy conventional understanding of how technology functioned. The Engine of Woes, with its mysterious moving components and unclear purpose, might serve as a control mechanism or calculation device that activates when all 9 artifacts are present. The other artifacts might contain components or generate fields that, when brought together in the proper configuration, create conditions allowing Vulkan to return from wherever he currently resides. The completion theory aligns with the Salamander's understanding of their Primarch's methodical nature. Vulkan rarely acted impulsively or without careful planning. His decision to create specific artifacts, scatter them across the galaxy, and leave instructions for their recovery suggests a deliberate system rather than arbitrary mysticism. The difficulty of recovering the artifacts ensures that only his sons, working across millennia with dedication and patience, could fulfill the conditions he established. This serves as both a test of the chapter's worthiness and a practical safeguard, ensuring that Vulkan returns only when the Salamanders have demonstrated they maintain the values he instilled in them. However, the completion theory faces challenges that its proponents must address. The most significant issue is that several of the artifacts remain lost despite 10,000 years of searching. The Unbound Flame's location is unknown, and the Obsidian Chariot has not been seen since before the Heresy. 2 artifacts' identities remain secret even within the chapter, known only to the highest-ranking members. If the completion of the collection is truly the sole requirement for Vulkan's return, then the Primarch's reappearance depends on the successful conclusion of searches that have already consumed millennia without success. This creates a potential problem where the conditions for return might never be met, leaving the Salamanders in perpetual waiting for a Primarch who cannot return because the mechanism he established cannot be completed. The webway theory offers a different perspective on Vulkan's current state and the circumstances that might enable his return. This theory begins with the undisputed fact that Vulkan entered the webway gate on Nocturne and has not emerged from it in any confirmed manner since that departure. The webway, the ancient network of tunnels through the warp created by the Old Ones and later maintained and expanded by the Eldar, represents a realm that operates according to rules different from both real space and the conventional warp. Time flows inconsistently within the webway, distances do not correspond to their real space equivalents, and the network structure includes sections that have been damaged, corrupted, or sealed off over the millions of years since its creation. Proponents of the webway theory suggest several possible scenarios for Vulkan's situation. The most straightforward is that the Primarch became lost within the webway's labyrinthine passages. The network extends across the entire galaxy and beyond, with countless branches and connections that even the Eldar no longer fully map or understand. A traveler without extensive knowledge of the webway's structure could wander for subjective centuries without finding an exit to real space. Vulkan's perpetual nature would prevent death from ending such wandering, but it would not necessarily provide knowledge of how to navigate the webway or locate functional gates that lead back to Imperial space. A more complex version of the webway theory suggests that Vulkan might be trapped rather than simply lost. The webway contains dangers beyond disorientation. Demons sometimes breach into the tunnels from the warp, particularly in sections where the webway's structure has been damaged. The Eldar maintain defenses and wards in regions they control, but vast sections of the webway lie abandoned or fallen to chaos corruption. Vulkan might have encountered such threats and become trapped fighting them, unable to disengage from combat or progress toward an exit while enemies continue to manifest. His perpetual nature would make him an eternal combatant in such a scenario, dying and resurrecting in an endless cycle of battle with no resolution. The most intriguing variant of the webway theory proposes that Vulkan deliberately travels through the network, seeking something or pursuing objectives that require him to remain within the webway rather than returning to real space. This interpretation suggests the Primarch's departure was not a one-way journey into exile, but the beginning of a quest whose completion requires extended time within the webway. The nature of such a quest remains speculative, but possibilities include searching for lost human colonies that might be accessible only through the webway, seeking ancient technology or knowledge hidden in forgotten sections of the network, or even attempting to repair or modify the webway's structure in ways that would benefit the Imperium. Evidence supporting the webway theory includes the sightings of Vulkan-like figures across the galaxy that appear and disappear without explanation. If the Primarch maintains access to the webway and knowledge of where its gates connect to real space, he could emerge at various locations, intervene in battles or crises, and then retreat back into the network. This would explain how a single individual could appear in widely separated regions without using conventional travel methods that would leave records or require extended time. The webway provides instant transportation across galactic distances, and someone with knowledge of its structure could use it to appear anywhere that possesses a functional gate. The voluntary exile theory takes a different approach to understanding Vulkan's absence, suggesting that the Primarch chose to remove himself from the Imperium until specific conditions were met that go beyond simple recovery of artifacts. This theory emphasizes Vulkan's statements before his departure that he would return when the Imperium faced its darkest hour, and when his sons proved themselves worthy of his return. Proponents of this theory argue that these conditions represent more than just temporal markers. They describe states of being that the Salamanders chapter and the wider Imperium must achieve through their own actions, rather than through simple passage of time or completion of mechanical tasks. The worthiness criterion presents particular complexity in this interpretation. What constitutes proof that the Salamanders have remained worthy of their Primarch's return? The chapter has maintained its adherence to the Promethean cult's principles across 10 millennia, continuing to prioritize civilian protection and practicing the craftsmanship that Vulkan valued. However, the voluntary exile theory suggests that worthiness might require something more specific, perhaps a test or challenge that the chapter has not yet faced or overcome. Vulkan might be waiting for his sons to demonstrate particular qualities or achieve specific accomplishments that prove they have not just maintained his teachings, but fully internalized and evolved them. The darkest hour condition creates similar interpretive challenges. The Imperium has faced numerous crises throughout its 10,000-year history, any of which might have qualified as the darkest hour from certain perspectives. The Horus Heresy nearly destroyed the Imperium and left the Emperor entombed on the Golden Throne. The War of the Beast brought orcs to Terra itself and demonstrated vulnerabilities in the Imperium's defenses. The Age of Apostasy saw the Imperium tear itself apart in civil war. Multiple Tyrannid hive fleets have threatened to consume entire sectors. The opening of the Great Rift and the current era Indomitus present threats on a scale not seen since the Heresy. If Vulkan's return depends on the darkest hour arriving, then either that hour has not yet come despite all these crises, or the Primarch's definition of darkest hour involves factors beyond simple threat assessment. Perhaps the condition requires not just external threats, but a specific state of the Imperium's character or leadership. The return of Robute Guilliman and the launching of the Indomitus Crusade demonstrate that the Imperium retains capacity for organized resistance and strategic thinking. Perhaps Vulkan waits for a moment when the Imperium's situation is so desperate that conventional leadership and tactics cannot save it, when only a Primarch's intervention can prevent final collapse. The voluntary exile theory also considers the possibility that Vulkan imposed a time limit on his absence unrelated to external conditions. The Primarch might have determined that the Imperium needed to develop certain capabilities or characteristics that could only emerge during his absence. His presence, while beneficial in immediate tactical and strategic terms, might prevent the Imperium from developing the self-reliance and resilience necessary for long-term survival. By removing himself, Vulkan forces the Imperium and his chapter to function without depending on a Primarch's guidance, strengthening them in ways that his continued presence would prevent. Analysis of these theories against established lore and current galactic conditions suggests that elements of each might contain truth rather than any single theory providing complete explanation. The completion theory aligns with Vulkan's methodical nature and his skills as an artificer, suggesting that the artifacts do serve a practical function in facilitating his return. However, the difficulty of completing the collection and the millennia that have passed without success indicate that artifact recovery alone might not be sufficient. The artifacts might be necessary but not sufficient conditions for return, components of a larger system that also requires other factors to align. The webway theory explains many of the reported sightings and the mysterious appearances of items bearing Vulkan's distinctive craftsmanship in unexpected locations. If the Primarch maintains access to the webway and uses it for travel, he could operate across the galaxy while remaining hidden from Imperial observation. However, this theory struggles to explain why Vulkan would not simply emerge permanently if he retains ability to access real space at will. The sightings suggest brief interventions rather than sustained presence, indicating either that Vulkan faces constraints preventing permanent return or that he chooses to limit his interventions for reasons the theory does not adequately address. The voluntary exile theory provides the most satisfying explanation for why Vulkan has not returned despite the Imperium facing multiple existential crises over 10 millennia. If the Primarch waits for specific conditions beyond simple threat level, then his continued absence despite terrible dangers makes sense. However, this theory relies heavily on speculation about Vulkan's reasoning and the criteria he might have established, with limited textual evidence to support specific interpretations of what worthiness or darkest hour actually mean in this context. The return of Guilliman provides the most significant new data point for analyzing these theories. A Primarch who was believed permanently lost to stasis has returned to active command, demonstrating that such returns are possible and that the mechanisms enabling them can involve unexpected factors. Guilliman's resurrection required Eldar intervention using powers derived from their god of death, circumstances that no one could have predicted or planned for. This suggests that Vulkan's return might similarly depend on factors beyond what the Salamanders or Imperial authorities can directly control or predict. Guilliman's example also demonstrates the impact that a returned Primarch can have on the Imperium's situation. His strategic leadership, his authority to reorganize Imperial military forces, and the morale boost his presence provides have all contributed to the Imperium's ability to respond to the Era Indomitus's challenges. These benefits suggest that Vulkan's return would provide similar advantages, though with different character reflecting the differences between the two Primarchs. Where Guilliman brings organizational skill and strategic thinking, Vulkan would bring combat expertise against chaos forces, emphasis on civilian protection, and the psychological impact of a Primarch whose legend emphasizes compassion rather than efficiency. The current galactic situation creates conditions that align with multiple aspects of the various return theories. The Imperium faces threats on a scale that genuinely qualifies as the darkest hour, with the galaxy literally split and demon incursions occurring across thousands of worlds. The Salamanders have intensified their quest for the remaining artifacts, driven by conviction that completing the collection has become more urgent than ever. The opening of the Great Rift has disrupted the webway in ways that might affect Vulkan's ability to navigate it, or might create new opportunities for him to emerge. All these factors suggest that if the conditions for Vulkan's return can be met, the current era provides circumstances where those conditions might align. The most likely scenario for Vulkan's return, synthesizing elements from all three major theories, involves multiple necessary conditions rather than a single trigger. The artifacts must be recovered and placed in the Vault of Prometheus, fulfilling the mechanical or mystical requirements that Vulkan established through their creation. The Imperium must face threats that genuinely represent its darkest hour, creating the necessity for a Primarch's intervention. The Salamanders must demonstrate continued worthiness through their actions and adherence to the Promethean cult's principles. These conditions must align simultaneously, creating a moment when Vulkan's return becomes both possible and necessary. The Primarch's unique character as the most compassionate of his brothers gives his potential return particular significance beyond simply adding another powerful warrior to the Imperium's forces. The Era Indomitus has pushed the Imperium toward increasingly brutal tactics and acceptance of casualties that previous generations might have considered unacceptable. The scale of the threats and the desperation of the situation create pressure to abandon principles in favor of expedience, to sacrifice civilian populations for tactical advantage, and to view human lives as nothing more than resources to be expended in the Emperor's service. Vulkan's return would provide a counterweight to these tendencies, a voice of authority arguing that the Imperium's purpose is protecting humanity rather than simply ensuring its survival as an abstract concept. His presence would remind Imperial forces that the countless billions they defend are not just statistics, but individuals whose lives have value. His example would demonstrate that compassion and effectiveness are not mutually exclusive, that protecting civilians can be integrated into military strategy without fatally compromising operational capability. In an era when the Imperium risks losing its humanity in the struggle to survive, Vulkan represents the possibility of maintaining the values that make humanity worth saving. The Salamanders continue their vigil, maintain their quest, and prepare for their Primarch's return with faith sustained across 10 millennia. They do not know exactly when or how Vulkan will emerge from wherever he has been, whether he will walk out of the Vault of Prometheus when the last artifact is placed within it, whether he will step through a webway gate as he departed, or whether his return will take some form they have not anticipated. What they know with certainty is that their father has not abandoned them, that he watches over them still through whatever means his perpetual nature allows, and that when the conditions he established are finally met, he will return to lead his sons once more in defense of the Imperium and the human populations it protects. The galaxy burns, the Great Rift tears reality itself, and the Imperium faces enemies on all sides. The darkest hour has arrived, and with it, the hope that Vulkan will return to bring his fire, his hammer, and his compassion to a galaxy that desperately needs all three.